Dear audience, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you here in Utrecht in this main hall of university on behalf of Museum Huis Doorn. Huis Doorn, a state museum in the Netherlands with its own history. We will present today the results of a project on German colonialism while the German ambassador is entering. Very welcome, Mr. Noon. We will present the results of a research project which was directed by Dr. Britta Schilling in cooperation with Huis Doorn. And I welcome our distinguished guests in the order of the program. First of all, Ms. Barbara Wolfensperger, the head of the State Department on Culture and Media in the Netherlands. And as Huis Doorn is a state museum, it is very important to us that you are here, Ms. Wolfensperger. Very welcome. And you will tell us something about Dutch policy on colonial collections. Then Dr. Britta Schilling. She led the project, wrote a book that reflects the provenance research, and she is responsible for the scientific quality of the research and the conscience of the academic reliability of this project. And we are very lucky that you are here, Dr. Schilling. Of course, we welcome the students who participated in this project. There were 12 of them, 12 students, and 2 of them will give a short presentation this afternoon. Anne-Lore de Kruijf and Jan IJzer-Kuipers. I welcome Professor Julia Binter from Bonn, University of Bonn, and she will tell something about the provenance research in Germany. And I think that comparative information is always very useful, especially from neighboring countries, and in our situation, especially between the Netherlands and Germany. Dr. Qingling Wang is specialist on Chinese art, curator at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and you will focus on William II and his Chinese art objects that come from the Forbidden City. They are a kind of hidden treasure for Huis Doorn because they were never exhibited until now. Dr. Alfred Hagemann, expert from the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, he addresses in his speech the colonial connections between the emperor and his city palace in Berlin, which is now the Humboldt Forum. Welcome to your excellencies, Dr. Cyril Noon, ambassador of Germany, and also the ambassador of Namibia, Dr. Mekonyo K. Panda, but she didn't arrive until now, but she will come. She is on her way, is reported to us, so she will be here in some time. And I think it's very meaningful that just the ambassador of Germany and the ambassador of Namibia are here together today. And then last but not least, I will welcome Dr. Joep Schenk, assistant professor at Utrecht University, and he will be the chair this afternoon and guide us through the program. And I want to welcome Professor Thomas Vasens, the Dean of the Faculty Humanities, on behalf of the board of Utrecht University. We are very grateful that we can use this hall, this very important hall, with its meaningful history, and that we can gather here today. Thank you very much. And the cooperation between Utrecht University and Museum Huis Doorn is to us very important because we are not only interested in the research projects, but also we value guiding students from college to being professional historians. And that is the cooperation between our 2 institutions very fruitful. And last but not least, I want to welcome Cornelis van der Bas, the curator of Huis Doorn. He has been out of office for some time due to his health, but we are very, very pleased and very happy that you are here again, Cornelis, and thanks for your part in this project. Ladies and gentlemen, what could be the reason for Museum Huis Doorn to give attention to the colonial policy of a neighboring country? The Netherlands have their own problems, their own matters with the former colonies. So why give attention to the burden of other countries? The first answer is very simple. Our visitors ask questions about the collection, and of course we must be able to answer them. A museum should be aware of the history of the objects that are in its collection. But the second answer is, I think, in a certain way more important, because it's about morality. When we exhibit objects that are witnesses of a dispute or contested past, the museum has to provide this knowledge clearly. The uneasy and maybe guilt-ridden knowledge has to be clarified. And that's the reason of our provenance research. Museum Huis Doorn does not look to our predecessors with an elevated or judging view of a high moral position, as if we don't make the mistakes of former generations. As you all know, slavery is still common in our world, and we all participate in it by buying disputed goods, by watching sport matches played in stadiums that were built by slaves, and in our big cities, many illegal people have to find their way, and often they can't. That is our present problem. And how will coming generations judge about our behavior? We can only guess. But it should inspire us to do the good things now. I finish with a short word related to the special hall we gather here. Here the freedom of the Netherlands was forced and signed in 1579, Utrecht Union. Let us hope that this spirit of freedom will endure and that we remain vigilant and stand up for the rights of all people to the same freedom. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I would like to invite Barbara Wolfensberger. Barbara Wolfensberger has been working as Director General of Culture and Media at the Ministry of Education, Culture and Science since July 2017, if I'm not wrong. And in that role, she is responsible for the management of heritage and arts, media and creative industry, international policy, the National Archive, and the National Service for Cultural Heritage. So that's quite a job, I would say. Ms. Wolfensberger, I would like to invite you to the chair. Thanks.
It is actually a great job, because that's why I'm allowed to be here. I'm a little bit smaller than Herman is. Thank you. I hope it stays like this. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's so good to be back in this important and beautiful hall. Last time I was here, I was talking about the Fulbright scholarships. So that was international policy from an educational standpoint, and this is a very different topic. Your Excellency, so good of you to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, museums are our memory. They tell us about the history of individuals, of communities, of the Netherlands, and of the world. Our country has numerous wonderful collections that bring history to life in our museums. The important role they play is wholeheartedly supported by society and the world of politics, as the calls for a National Slavery Museum and a National Historical Museum clearly demonstrate. The beautiful Huis Doorn gives us a direct insight into the history and the tragedy of World War I by showcasing the life of Emperor Wilhelm II in exile. State Secretary of Culture and Media, Fleur Greper, visited Huis Doorn last week and was full of enthusiasm when she told me all about that visit. The stories that museums tell are constantly changing. As society develops, new perspectives on history emerge. New questions are raised about the way we see the collections. By addressing these questions, we expand our knowledge and enrich our collective memory. It's a memory based on thorough and critical research into collections. I'd like to offer my sincere thanks to Huis Doorn for providing the space for a conversation about this research here today. The results that extensive research can bring is something we witnessed last August. We witnessed this ourselves in Colombo, Sri Lanka. I was there when the then State Secretary Gunai Uslu and the Sri Lankan Minister of Culture signed a document agreeing to the transfer of ownership of 6 objects. Objects that had long been on display at the Rijksmuseum Amsterdam. Extensive research had demonstrated that these objects were stolen by the Dutch from the Kingdom of Kandy. At the signing, the response in the room was emotional and even a little incredulous. to actually see this happen in our lifetime, in my lifetime, people said, they are really coming back. It was an incredibly emotional moment. A very similar feeling reverberated through the room at the Wereldmuseum Leiden, when in July of last year, 472 objects were given back to Indonesia. Objects like the important Kris Puputan Klungkung, a dagger that was looted when the entire court of the Prince of Klungkung, under siege by the Dutch, committed mass ritual suicide. These returns are important milestones for museums in the Netherlands, but much more for the countries of origin. They are not only of great cultural or spiritual value, they are not to the communities where the objects came from. They also serve as witnesses from the past that can be used by museums in the countries of origin to tell their own histories. The Indonesian Director General of Culture, Hilmar Farid, a great friend of us, had this to say about the now returned statues from the temple in Singosari. These statues tell a story, and that story can come back to life in Indonesia. They can once more become part of religious activities where people can bring them offerings. Communities and their stories and traditions torn away by the theft of their cultural heritage. This thing is moving downwards. Wait a minute. Seems better. And there it goes again. Thank you. It's sort of very close. Communities and their stories and traditions torn away by the theft of their cultural heritage. This injustice is still felt by many people to this day and has to be addressed. Our national policy for dealing with colonial collections is based on the principle that the Netherlands recognizes that the theft of objects in the colonial period is an historic injustice. An independent committee chaired by Lilian Gonsalves Ho-Kang-Yu advises the ministry about the requests for return based on provenance research conducted by the museums. The key principle here is that cultural heritage objects taken from former Dutch colonies are to be returned unconditionally if the country of origin requests this. Ladies and gentlemen, our policy is not only about the repatriation of historical facts. Although that's a significant step that has great symbolism, it is also part of a much more extensive process that is at least as valuable. This process starts with museums taking a critical attitude to their own collections. A critical attitude that also provides plenty of room for such questions are: where do the collections come from? How did they find themselves here? What is their history? And who did they belong to? Documentation concerning the provenance of objects is one of the basic principles in the International Code of Ethics for museums. Museums cannot simply ignore questions of this kind and must place the provenance of their collections under scrutiny. This kind of research can tell us more about the complex shared history of the Netherlands and its former colonies. Cooperation with countries of origin is therefore also essential in ensuring that a careful approach is adopted when dealing with colonial collections. Indonesia and Sri Lanka underlined the importance of cooperation on this topic in the discussions we had with them. They want to share and develop knowledge on collections, as we do too. I look forward to many fruitful exchanges between experts of different countries in the future. Because these exchanges can learn us a lot about the collections. In Sri Lanka, we heard an interesting example of a different form of collection management. There, palm leaf manuscripts are maintained using a special oil. This treatment is rooted in local knowledge and experiences and is very different from the conservation methods we use in the Netherlands. By sharing this kind of practices, we can ensure that we improve the management of all our heritage. In order to support cooperation between museums and the provenance research into colonial collections, a special consortium was recently established. This consortium includes the Wereldmuseum, the Rijksmuseum, the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Museum Bronbeek, and the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands. This consortium brings together expertise about provenance research into colonial collections. They are now turning their attention to the development of an online platform where it will ultimately be possible to find all the colonial objects in the Netherlands. In short, we're focusing on more transparency of our collections and on more cooperation. That is the only way we can truly understand and acknowledge the injustice of taking objects during the colonial period. Through cooperation and research, we're strengthening international networks and are building on mutual trust. Most importantly, all of this will enable us to tell new stories. Stories that demonstrate how all of us share complex histories. Stories that emerge by critically scrutinizing collections, just as Huis Doorn has now done. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about this research today. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wolfsberger. Perhaps there are some very brief questions. Does someone want to ask a question? We have time for a very, very brief
We should have announced that beforehand so they could prepare.
No questions for now?
Do you have a question?
Well, I can think of a question. Is it, as you said, so last year the Independent Colonial Collections Committee advised the ministry that cultural goods lost involuntarily in former Dutch colonies must be returned unconditionally if the country of origin requests it.
Yes.
So, in your mind, there is no questions asked when any country asks for a repatriation of colonial art or of art?
Well, there are lots of questions asked, but that's all about the provenance research. As soon as provenance research has shown that artifacts were taken by us, by the Dutch, and in our position right now, then it will be returned when it's from our colonial period with our colonial partners. And there will be no questions asked further on what they're going to do with it, how they're going to preserve it. We have put our full trust in the official owners of the artifacts, yes.
I understand. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Next time, indeed, I will let you know you can ask questions. And I will also want to let you know that there is actually, this is being transmitted, right? We have a live internet stream. So you are informed about that as well. We are going to our next speaker. And our next speaker talking to us about provenance research and about how invisible history indeed is made visible or knowledgeable or understandable is Britta Schilling. She will present indeed her research that she has been conducting together with 13 students at Huis Doorn. Britta Schilling is Associate Professor of History at Utrecht University. She is the author of Post-Colonial Germany, Memories of Empire in a Decolonized Nation, which was published by Oxford University Press, as well as numerous other articles on colonialism, memory and material culture. Schilling was educated in history and art history at Brown, Rutgers and Oxford University, and was also a fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies here in Amsterdam. And she is the recipient of an NBO Aspasia grant for her research on the long shadow of German Empire in an international context. So I think we can speak of a true expert here. Britta, please take your chair. Thanks. And if there are questions afterwards, I will ask.
You've been warned, there'll be a test. Can you hear me all right? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be speaking here today on behalf of a whole team of researchers, and I'm really grateful to have this opportunity. I'd like to start with a little exercise in your historical imagination. You could close your eyes, you could just use your imagination, and I want to take you back to 1918. 1918, when the last German emperor, Wilhelm II, began his life in exile in the Netherlands. And I want you to imagine, to picture in your mind's eye, the 64 train wagons full of personal effects that he took with him. That's a hell of a lot of stuff. And this stuff, these things, these objects, have meant different things to different people over the course of the years since then. To the Kaiser and to his family, no doubt, they were a reminder of a lost homeland, of a lost nation, of a lost empire. To the many visitors to Museum Huis Doorn since then, since the 1950s, in fact, these things have offered a glimpse into an opulence of bygone days, an opulence that was fitting with the luxurious and sometimes eccentric lifestyle of a deposed monarch. Now, to our research team, some of these things have become a unique means of gaining new insights into the troubled history of Germany's colonial past. And today I'm going to show some pictures of some of these objects in my presentation, but I do want to let you know that some of them include pretty racist depictions, and you might find them offensive, so you may choose not to look at these images. Now, the period of formal German colonial rule was relatively short, a mere 30 years, a lot of scholars say sometimes. But I hardly need to remind some of the people here today, I will anyway for the sake of our wider audience, it had long-lasting effects in Germany and abroad. It was characterized by extreme violence, by the genocide of the Herero and Nama in what was German Southwest Africa, today Namibia, the massacre of Chinese combatants and civilians in the so-called Boxer War, the slaughter of adherents of the Maji belief and other combatants and civilians in what was German East Africa and what is today Tanzania. But it was also characterized by what scholar Rob Nixon has called slow violence, the more insidious, long-lasting social and environmental effects of land expropriation, of infrastructural change, of settlement programs and extractive economies. Colonial mentalities sanctioned these measures, and that created deep divisions between people of different ethnic backgrounds. So what role did the Kaiser, as the formal head of state, play in German colonialism? Well, there are several ways of approaching this question. We could try to take the lead, follow the lead of historians such as John Röhl or Christopher Clark, and try to untangle the complexities of the Kaiser's prerogative. What was he allowed to do? What was he not allowed to do? From things like imperial edicts, from correspondence, from the nitty-gritty traces of decision-making processes when it came to military deployment overseas. We might try the approach of the legal scholar Jeremy Sarkin, who puts forward a kind of case against the Kaiser by building a sort of character profile of a deeply racist man who surely must have issued a secret order for the extermination of the Herero. An order, he argues, that has since been deliberately swept under the carpet. Now, this kind of speculation, this kind of scholarship hasn't been very well received by historians because we need that tangible evidence to prove our points. So we might use the approach that was recently employed by the historian Matthew Fitzpatrick. And Fitzpatrick spent years and years poring over archival documents, Foreign Office, Colonial Office documents, to better understand the Kaiser's role in international affairs and imperial affairs above all. And he came across also his relationships with other monarchs, other world leaders. Sultan Abdelaziz of Morocco, Prince Chun of China, King Njoya of Bamoun in Cameroon. And in his account, in Fitzpatrick's account, the Kaiser appears as someone who is largely uninterested in colonial matters, unless, of course, he was prompted to take an interest by his advisors. So we could continue along any of these routes, or we might try a different approach. We might take a step back and consider in what sort of a socio-cultural context political and military decisions about the governance of overseas empire were made. What was the Kaiser's colonial worldview? It works great. So, worldview, what do I mean by worldview? Well, this idea goes back to a third generation of scholars from the so-called Annales school of thought, French school of thought. And this third generation of historians and other scholars were very active in the 1970s, 1980s, and they've been very influential in cultural history since then. Worldviews likens a bit to their idea of mentalité, mentalities, how people thought about their world at a particular time, how they saw the world around them. Now, the Annales scholars sought to uncover this worldview, particularly the worldviews of peasants, of the working, of the lower classes. However, we might borrow their approach and start to analyze the colonial worldview of the Kaiser. So how do we get at this colonial worldview? Well, as a starting point, we went through the Kaiser's stuff. And here, students were guided by the tireless work of Cornelis van der Baas, curator of Museum Huis Doorn, who trawled through the museum archives and the depot to find some appropriate objects whose histories were still waiting to be written. We found some interesting, sometimes deeply unsettling, stories behind these things. Monique Anker, for example, one of our students, scrutinized the Kaiser's sketch of what he called the yellow peril, die gelbe Gefahr. He saw this yellow peril as a threat that was emanating from the Far East at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's not coming through very clear on this monitor, I think, at the moment, but there's a sort of cloud with a dragon in it coming through from the Far East, sort of epitomizing the Kaiser's imagination at the time. Now, this is a sketch. It was made into a lithograph and into engravings and was widely distributed to other world leaders and to German troops departing for China. Laurens Krielaert, here today, looked at colonial organizations and pro-colonial propaganda and popular culture. He spent quite a bit of his internship looking at slides, both in and outside of the Kaiser's possession, and coming to grips with what a Lichtbildvortrag really entailed. Here's a slide from a Lichtbildvortrag. You might translate it as magic lantern show. Laurens, I'm sure, will be happy to give you the more detailed explanation of what really went on in a Lichtbildvortrag, but in a sense, this was sort of an early 20th century PowerPoint presentation, popular form of entertainment. Now, through Laurens's research, we also started to learn more about the extent to which not just the Kaiser himself, but also other members of the Hohenzollern family were deployed as representatives of the German colonial project. And we learned that the Kaiser was in possession of some pretty considerable sized things in what was then German Southwest Africa. He, in fact, purchased a Karakul sheep farm in what is now Namibia in 1912, a farm that was said to have formerly belonged to the Nama leader Hendrik Witbooi, and Witbooi was killed by the Germans in 1905. Michiel Mulder's research focused on a polo helmet. And the research took him from the kind of quirky to the more serious means of modern diplomacy. The helmet was manufactured by Herbert Johnson Hatters, which, as Michiel was delighted to find out, is exactly the same company that made the hats for Indiana Jones and Peaky Blinders. That helmet, though, this helmet was worn by the German Crown Prince on his visit to India in 1910, 1911. Now you could say, whoa, India, that wasn't part of the German Empire, was it? No. But playing polo in the British colonies, as Michiel tells us in his piece, was a way for Wilhelm's son to display masculinity, athletic prowess, social status, but also a means of a kind of soft power diplomacy, hobnobbing with British imperial elites, seeing how things were done elsewhere, and then bringing this knowledge back home. From Marit de Wit, we learned about a deeply offensive racist coin, and now I warn you, this is really nasty piece, that was gifted to the Kaiser by the mayor of Zeist in the 1920s to commemorate the campaign against the occupation of the Rhineland area by French colonial troops. This was from 1918 to 1930. But we also learned, importantly, about another campaign. The calls for resistance to this racist propaganda by Black Germans such as Louis Brody or Mbebe Mpesa, a Cameroonian-born a person who was living in Germany at the time. Also by the Bund van Surinamers, the organization of Surinamese in the Netherlands, protested against this. From Yi Lung Chung, we began to uncover further resonances of empire in the Kaiser's life in exile during the interwar period. Yi Lung wrote about the Kaiser's design for an emblem or a badge for the Dorner Arbeitsgemeinschaft. Now, the Dorner Arbeitsgemeinschaft was an association of scholars who met regularly at Dorn in the 1930s and who were working on, broadly speaking, world cultures, an interest in world cultures. Now, Yi Lung also took a closer look at the Kaiser's library, and here's just one sample from that, to find out to what extent we might call the Kaiser a colonial revisionist. And by colonial revisionism, I mean the movement in the interwar period that was demanding, first of all, that a retraction of the claim that Germany wasn't fit to rule colonial people, and secondly, a call for the return of the colonies to Germany since they had been ceded in 1919. So, was the Kaiser a colonial revisionist? Well, the short answer is yes, very much so. The long answer, you will have to read Yi Lung's article or ask him about it. I won't go into a full analysis of all the objects that we looked at. You'll have to read the publication for that. And we'll also, as mentioned before, we'll also hear from Anne-Laure de Kruijf and from Jan Isaac-Kuipers later on their research. But I think it is important to name all of the other students who worked on this project in one form or another and deserve recognition for their labor. So in addition to those I've named, there was also Kati Ammann, Annick Daniels, Laurie Kant, Anneville Nieuwenhuizen, Lizzie Rigdon, and Otto Sander. And so you can see, bit by bit, our narrative came together like a kind of jigsaw puzzle, one object at a time. And we could use this as a basis to really get to grips with the Kaiser's colonial worldview. And then we could work this out further using some of the other more traditional sources available to historians. Now, the picture we got then, as you can imagine, we love to say as historians, was complex. But I managed to distill some main ideas from this insights, some main ideas from this picture for you and some key insights. Now first, our research has revealed new insights into the Kaiser's relationship to German colonialism. It's shown that Wilhelm II was more interested and involved in colonial matters than historians have previously acknowledged. The Kaiser wasn't just a figurehead of the German Empire, but he was also an active participant in and shaper of the German colonial worldview. Our second set of insights concern the nature of this worldview. The Kaiser's colonial worldview was subject to change, to opportunism, to personal relationships, and to emotion. And that kind of situation, then, may have enabled individuals to believe they could read his intentions before they were uttered, and to commit to decisive and even violent actions in the name of the Kaiser. On top of that, the Kaiser was a man very aware of the possibilities of various forms of media. He often used these to plant the seed of colonialist and racist worldviews in his subjects. And I'm thinking here, for example, of his speech to German troops departing for the Boxer War in China in 1900, a speech that was also well covered by the press. He told them, "Pardon wird nicht gegeben." You will give no quarter. There will be no prisoners taken. Willingly or unwittingly, he also furthered extreme violence by simply sitting back and doing nothing at times, allowing situations to escalate without calling parliament or recalling personnel. As other historians have found, he was very reluctant to call back Lothar von Trotha from Southwest Africa following the genocide of the Herero. And ultimately, he only did so after a lot of delay and after being urged to do so by his advisors. To date, there is no evidence, we've found no evidence that the Kaiser provided direct order to physically exterminate the Herero or any other ethnic group for that matter, but he also didn't explicitly prevent it. In fact, the Kaiser actively helped to construct a political, social, and cultural colonial worldview in which an order to exterminate indigenous populations was made possible. A world in which individuals felt that they could justifiably commit grave acts of violence in his name. Indeed, some may have felt compelled to do so because they knew they would be rewarded if they succeeded. The Kaiser's worldview was also subject to contradictions. Wilhelm II condoned violence against indigenous populations, but he was also fascinated by other cultures and ethnicities, as his library at Huis Doorn shows. He kept and he displayed deeply offensive, racist images of blacks, yet he upheld personal relationships with black Germans in his service. He publicly argued for German involvement in East Africa to end the regional slave trade, but under his rule, hundreds, perhaps thousands of Herero and Nama perished or performed unpaid slave labor during the internment in concentration camps in German Southwest Africa. So we can think of this as a sort of cognitive dissonance in his worldview. And his worldview continued to evolve. During his time in exile, Wilhelm continued to be interested in the colonial cause. He kept up relations with members of the colonial elite, some of whom came to visit him at Huis Doorn. He was fascinated by the theories of the ethnologist Leo Frobenius, and the two of them had a very close relationship. At Doorn, the Kaiser also became increasingly interested in the Dutch colonial empire, and above all, the Dutch East Indies. So now these Lichtbildvorträge were being held about places in Southeast Asia. And here we start to see also that the Kaiser's colonial worldview, both during and after his reign, was as trans-imperial as it was nationalist imperialist. With this, I mean it drew on colonial knowledge that circulated across different realms of empire, be they German, British, or Dutch. I just want to check with you. I thought I had a half an hour. I will try to find a middle way. It's important to note, here's an important point though, and I can't stress this enough, that the Kaiser was not simply a man of his time. Many other men and women during his time thought differently about inter-ethnic relations, about race, and about empire. And in our research, we paid close attention to the voices of the German parliamentary opposition, to Herero and Nama resistance leaders, and to Black Germans in Weimar Germany in order to better understand that world in which he functioned. I'd like to conclude with some points about the nature of doing imperial history today. Now, during the project, our students were a lot of the time taken behind the scenes of the museum, from the Kaiser's study to the servants' quarters, from the administrative headquarters in the gatehouse to the off-site museum depot. And I've heard back from them that these were some of the really exciting aspects of their work on this project. But there were also some boring aspects. There were aspects like background reading on German colonialism, learning to read Zitterlen, the German handwriting, trawling through reams and reams of the Deutsche Kolonialzeitung, which thankfully these days is online, but not all of these online repositories have a search function. So you go through every, page by page of this, the main press of the German colonial society. And this is just one example, and Laurens knows exactly what this is like, going through page by page, until you find this wonderful nugget, this visual sort of document celebrating the Kaiser by the German colonial society. And then you're told it can't be published because it's not a very good copy. But I got it in there, Laurens. So that's the kind of work we're talking about, juggling this with a full load of students as a student, right? Juggling this with other commitments. But I think all of our students have been on an incredible journey from knowing, most of them, very little about German colonialism to a lot of them being able to contribute original research in a very short amount of time. And during the course of the project, we also were confronted with a number of thorny questions about the practice of doing imperial research in imperial history. First of all, how should scholars and museums display visual culture, paintings, cartoons, photographs from colonial contexts? This more often than not means images that emerge from unequal power relations between, let's say, a photographer and their subject, between a painter and the object of their gaze. It's always a delicate balance between an accurate representation of even the most unappealing, disgusting aspects of the colonial past in order to educate, and on the other hand, respect for its victims, for its opponents, and for those who continue to feel its effects. When should we deliberately shock, and when should we choose not to look, in the words of Holocaust photography historian Susan A. Crane? How do we ensure that we don't keep reproducing stereotypical representations of the past? Do we have some sort of responsibility to also move beyond those? Temi Odumosu calls this the ethics of care, also involved in the digital reproduction of images of formerly colonized or enslaved peoples. Another question, how do we write about these objects that may have emerged out of colonial contexts and that may actually be looted art? How do we write about them in a way that pays attention to their original meanings, but also takes account of their history since then? And what do we mean by terms like multi-perspectivity, entangled histories, entangled pasts in practice? How do you present a multi-perspectival narrative when your starting point is the German Kaiser? Now, we sometimes had different views on these issues, and we didn't always agree, but we talked about them, we weighed options, and we considered other viewpoints. And this reminded me also that informed debate and disagreement about the past is what historical work is really about. It's what moves the field forward. The collaboration with Museum Huis Doorn was a unique way of working through some of these issues, and we want to thank the museum for opening their doors and for allowing us to take part in this process. What I think is important is that we continue to push the boundaries of what collaborative work in this field could be. Our students wrote some great object histories in a relatively short amount of time. But often to do proper provenance research requires a lot of time and a lot of resources. Now, since we started our project, a number of new funding mechanisms have appeared. The Netherlands scientific organization, the NVO, has announced a Provenance research fund, the research on collections within a colonial context. Utrecht University is actively seeking to build bridges abroad with initiatives like the Global Engagement Fund, a one-year pilot this year focusing on Africa. It's launched an incentive fund for impact-related research. And these are just some examples. But these sorts of impulses mean that we can, in future, do more to break out of our bubbles and to engage in meaningful exchange across institutional and geographical divides. And here I'm speaking in general, but especially to our students, the upcoming generation of researchers, teachers, curators, ambassadors in every sense of the word. Let's see this as a starting point. Let's use these opportunities. Let's think creatively about ways of addressing imperial legacies together. Let's work with scholars and students and artists from Namibia and from Tanzania and from China and the African diaspora in Europe. Let's do oral history together to better understand the traces of the colonial past in the present. Let's see the value of research in higher education, but also look beyond the university as a supreme authority of knowledge and insight. And every once in a while, let's be willing to be uncomfortable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Britta. You've been telling us, well, what the impact already is of the research you did, and that's already quite impressive, also with the help of our students. At the same time, you also show that this is only a very first step in the right direction. I can imagine that there is one question in the hall that we can still deal with.
I'm Jos van Beurden. Thank you very much for your very interesting speech, and I strongly support your final statement. In the beginning, you were talking about 64 wagons, train wagons, coming to the Netherlands with possessions. And you were also talking about the speech which the emperor was delivering for soldiers who were going to China. Now, as you probably know, many of these soldiers, they took war booty back and they offered it to the emperor. And my question is, have you found in these 64 wagons or in Huis Doorn any objects related to the war booty of the Boxers?
This is a good question, and which naturally comes up. I think we did not do research on all the contents of all the 64 wagons. We did research on the objects that were given to us also. So I can only comment on the histories of the objects that we worked with. One of those, or set of those objects, Anneville is going to talk about in a second. Anne-Laure, sorry, going to talk about in a second. And I think that will answer some of your questions. Start to answer some of their questions. What I can say is that there's still, as I mentioned, right, provenance research is really deep, intense research to find out where this stuff came from. We still have a lot of questions. Yeah. Thanks.
You've been paying tribute to the students working with you. I would like now to give Herman Sietsema the occasion to pay tribute to you as the primary investigator of this research.
Dear Britta, we are very impressed by your work and your book and the way you led this project. So we are very grateful for all you did and the quality of your work. And you were always in time. Unbelievable. And I learned there are still some questions left. Well, I see it as a kind of invitation to Huis Doorn to see if there is any possibility to come further with a new project. We are always into that, especially when there are funds, like you said, then we will try to get them. And we can try to come to a further cooperation between Utrecht University and Huis Doorn. And this is the first copy of your book. and I would like to hand it over with our great gratitude for your all you did, all your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Photo.
So now we have some time planned for, indeed, two students to present their research in this research project. So we are going to see a little bit more about the process behind this provenance research. I'm going to ask Jan IJse Kuipers to have his speech here. Jan IJse finished his bachelor in the history program of Utrecht University last year on a thesis about the Anglo-Saxon helmet, I remember, Jan IJse. But in this case, you will talk to us about a portrait of two persons that you have been studying and have been trying indeed to process or trying to see what the provenance was of these portraits, but also who these men were. Jan IJse, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I indeed focused my research on two portraits. Let's see if I can... Yes. Two portraits of French tirailleurs sénégalais. So these were African soldiers in French service, particularly during the First World War, before and afterwards. And these two portraits were in the private collection of the emperor that he also took to Doorn, which of course raises a number of questions. Why would the last German emperor take two portraits of two African men serving in the French army, fighting the German army in the First World War? Safe to say, as with most forms of provenance research, you start with many more questions than you have answers, and the further you go into your research, the more questions there often are. At first, little to nothing was known about either of these portraits. There was some writing on one of the portraits, the man wearing the brown cap, and this handwriting we at first supposed must have come from the painter of the portraits, Ernst Vollbeer, a German front painter who toured the fronts of Europe in 1914 and described in his diary painting a group of captured tirailleurs sénégalais near Berry-au-Bac, which is in North France, I remember. All that was written on the portrait was a date, October 1914, the place, Berry-au-Bac, and Senegalschütze am Transport nach Berlin Zoo, tirailleur sénégalais on his way to be transported to the zoo in Berlin. Now, as you may imagine, that could have been quite a shocking story, and that could have gotten very complicated to research. So the first thing we delved into is, well, what happened to these men? Why were they painted in the first place? It turns out, October 1914, the French are fighting the Germans on the Western Front, and in increasing numbers, the French are deploying troops from their colonies. Most of these from different regions in the Horn of Africa, or not the Horn of Africa, the West of Africa, came there partially voluntarily, partially also involuntarily, which is important to keep in mind. And both of these men were probably in one of the first two regiments that saw action in France from October or August 1914 forward. During the first Battle of Berry-au-Bac, these soldiers, together with a handful of other men, turned out to be captured by the German army after fierce fighting between the two armies, in which a number of prisoners were taken at the end of a short skirmish. Now the thing is, one of these portraits had a name on it, and that name proved a very good further point to delve into. It read Far Suri, as two different names, a first name and a second name. The only problem is, tracing that name through any French database gave absolutely zero results. It's of course not unimaginable that the names were left out of records, records got lost, this sort of stuff happens in archival research. So we had to drop that lead for the moment. I pursued some more leads in the form of general knowledge on these tirailleurs sénégalais, until at some point I ran into a small book called Les Noirs, or The Blacks, which was a compilation of experiences of often white French officers describing working with and commanding black troops in the First World War. Now, whatever you want to think about the political implications of a book like that, proved a very good starting point for further research into these two men particularly. It turned out one of the diaries used to compile the book was from a French officer, a lieutenant called Albert Mallet. And he describes fighting with the 1st Regiment of Tirailleurs Sénégalais at Berry-au-Bac at the right moment, matching up with the portraits. So I delved into his little diary entry. And it read that at some point during an attack on German lines, he got stuck in no man's land, had to spend the night there, and he was guarded by 2 of his, as he called, faithful Senegalese sergeants, one of whom, Fassouri, not spelled Far-Souri, but as one single surname. And that provided a very good hinge to delve further into the personal histories of at least one of the 2 men. Because as we had known, Far-Souri came up with no leads, but Fassouri, that suddenly made for a number of hits in French archives. And I know Britta discussed the trouble of reading German cursive. I can assure everyone that French handwriting from the early 20th century is not much better. Now, one of the most interesting conclusions from that diary entry was having this new sort of lead to pursue on a personal note, because suddenly the main question did not become how did these objects end up in the emperor's collection, but particularly also who were these men, what were their identities, why were they there, as far as anything could be found about that. So I pursued it further, and we found out that the man on the right, wearing a flat brown cap, named Fassouri, was transported not to the Berlin Zoo, as we may have imagined, because as we knew, human zoos were quite common throughout Europe, both before this period and still during the First World War, as far as we could find. But no, he was not transported to Berlin. He was taken to Darmstadt, a whole different direction in Germany, where he probably spent the rest of his life in imprisonment. But that sounds very harsh, until you realize that he only lived for 2 months after being captured. It turned out that Sergeant Fassouri died in December 1914, probably of wounds sustained in no man's land, in German imprisonment. And what we had done with this research is both attach a face to a name, attach an identity to portraits that were, until that time, just deemed black African men in the collection of the emperor, but also, in the end of the research, by pure dumb luck, while trying to find another source on an entirely unrelated project, well, did it again, we came across a picture on a German postcard. And I remember looking at this together with Cornelis as we were looking for a different postcard, looking at the man wearing the flat cap, and we looked at each other and we went, that's him. It has to be. It can be no other person. No one else would wear a cap that's not according to regimental standards. Lo and behold, the date matches up, because these cards were made in 1914. The place matches up. And he wears the same coat with the same tattered rip in the fabric on his upper left breast. So in the end, we had a name, we had a picture of the man, we had a portrait of the man, we knew what happened to him. He died in imprisonment while he was 18 years old in Darmstadt. And that is what I would like to end with, the importance of provenance research and how by really delving into these objects that often get overlooked or haven't been looked at in a new context, you can reattach identities and personal stories that have become entirely lost to history. And now, if anyone in his family ever wants to do research into this forefather that got lost during the First World War, they will not only have a picture of him that was probably not known so far, but they will also know that a portrait of their forefather hung in the military headquarters of the German emperor in the First World War and was taken to Huis Doorn in exile afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jan Eijsen. Next is Anne-Lore de Kruijf, and she attained her history bachelor's degree also here at Utrecht University last year on a thesis on the restitution of Chinese cultural objects. And now she is also museum assistant, and I forgot to say, but Jan Eijsen also became assistant curator at Huis Doorn, so these connections are getting more and more professional. Anne-Lore, I would like to give you the floor, and there's some time after Anne-Lore's speech to ask questions to both of our students.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this symposium today. During my final year at university, I started an internship at Museum Huis Doorn, which has brought me here on this stage today. Based on my specialization, I was introduced to 6 Chinese lacquer panels with back then an unknown past. They had magically appeared in the collection of Wilhelm II. I was asked by Museum Huis Doorn would you like to research these artifacts? And intrigued from the beginning, my answer was yes. What interests me foremost is the cultural phenomenon of these artifacts. The cultural phenomenon shapes itself by what is mentioned about the artifacts, what is known about the artifacts, what is unknown, and how do those aspects shape the context of the lacquer panels today. My aim is to bring awareness about the lacquer panels and shed light on its original context, instead of the lacquer panels being just some Chinese artifacts Wilhelm had in his collection. These artifacts are more than just that, and I assigned myself the job to make the original context known to the public, and specifically to you all present here today. With this in mind, I started my research. It was time for the lacquer panels being taken out of the shadow and brought into the light. The lacquer panels represent different scenes of the Taiwan Rebellion of 1787 and 1788. Descriptions of the different battle scenes of the Taiwan Rebellion can be read on the panels in Chinese Mandarin. The descriptions have been written by Emperor Qianlong, who ruled the Chinese Empire in the Qing dynasty in the 18th century. This can be concluded from the handwriting of the Chinese characters after having put multiple handwritten texts of Qianlong next to each other. When doing research, it is incredibly important to immerse yourself into the subject or artifact that you are working with. By having studied Chinese Mandarin at high school for 5 years and having a cultural interest in China, this aim was achieved very favorably. With assistance from my previous Chinese teacher, I was able to translate numerous characters on the panels. In this way, the lacquer panels were viewed in a most inclusive way. I also analyzed the stamps on the lacquer panels, which are primary proof that the panels were Qianlong's property. One of the stamps states, Gushe Tense Chebao, translated into English, treasure of the 7-year-old emperor. Together with Qianlong's handwriting, the portraying of Chinese victory, and his personal stamps, the lacquer panels are a confirmation of Qianlong's power and position in the Chinese Empire. The panels hung in the prominent military hall at the western side of the Forbidden City. The emperor invited officials from different countries to show off his political victories in this lustrous hall. After this insight into the lacquer panels and materialistic aspects, I would like to talk furthermore about another important aspect of my research, namely inclusion used in vocabulary. During my research, I have discovered a vivid Western language being used for these Chinese lacquer panels and its history. For example, in my research, I introduced the term Ihe Tuan movement when talking about the Western popularized term Boxer Rebellion, as it has very different meaning. It can be translated into the righteous and harmonious fists. The word boxer has been used because Western alliances viewed the martial arts the members of this movement practiced as Chinese boxing, which takes away from its cultural value. Just as the word rebellion, which was the incorrect term, as the movement's intentions were not to rebel against the Qing government, but instead to the Western alliances who invaded the Chinese Empire. Using inclusive vocabulary is extremely important when doing research, as it changes the dynamic of the narrative from Western to Chinese. By upholding Western terms, the lacquer panels keep being distanced from their original context. For my research, I looked back at numerous traces of the lacquer panels left behind in history to discover how the lacquer panels had been viewed over the last 100 years. I discovered, for example, that the 6 lacquer panels were located in the horse stables of Huis Doorn in 1952, completely disconnected from their origin. To bring the 6 lacquer panels closer to their rightful origin, I also researched the remaining lacquer panels, because the 6 panels were once a series of 12. It is the rightful thing to do, as they portray a story all 12 together, and were meant to keep conveying a story about Chinese victory. The panels are now separated and unfortunately scattered around the world, which takes away from its cultural and historical essence. Only one location of the remaining lacquer panels is publicly known. The other panels leave small traces in history, still undiscovered, far away from their original context and molded in a misshaped narrative. For further details and context about the whereabouts of the lacquer panels and the connection with the Boxer Rebellion, which was just asked, I would like to recommend you to read my article in the catalog or come see me during the break or after the symposium. Finally, I would like to finish my talk by stating that it's incredibly important to raise awareness, to shed light on untold stories like the lacquer panels and act accordingly on it. Because this story is just one of the many more stories and objects that are tucked away and hidden, sometimes hidden from the eye in a private collection or in a horse stable, and sometimes right in front of us in a museum. Stories like these can help people understand. Most importantly, it makes us think about what to do next. What other appropriate steps need to be taken to place artifacts in their rightful narrative? If you have any questions, please feel free to approach me after. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks, Annelore. Thanks, Jan Eijsen. So both your stories show how inventive you must be and also what kind of skills you need, Chinese for example, to get to grips with what these images or what these objects actually mean. And you're saying that objects, pictures, but even language is never neutral, and we are looking for what the original values that were attached to these ideas and these pictures, how difficult that is, but also how valuable this is. So thank you very much for these speeches, for these talks. Are there any questions from the hall? Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question to Jan Eijsen. Thank you very much for your story. I think it's very important to give a name and a history to every human being as the tirailleur which you showed there. So that's very, very interesting. My question is of a more general form. In the French army in World War I, there were black soldiers. In the German army, actually in Europe, there were no black soldiers, if I am correct. Is there, from the French side, was there a policy which was not only the policy of we need the guys because we need the human features on the field to fight off the Germans? Was there something else, like accepting them as being more full-fledged citizens as German colonial black people would have been in the German system? Was there an element of that?
To a degree, you could say that there is an element where the employment of colonial troops in the French army in the First World War led to more acceptance of especially black people in France after the war. But that also draws open a very, very big country-sized can of worms on the treatment and reception of tirailleurs Senegalese veterans after the war. And the only thing I have time to really delve into, I would love to discuss this further, but is that it took until last year for all tirailleurs Senegalese, all veterans of any conflict in the French army, to be reimbursed with military pensions to the same degree as any white combatant in the French army. So although there may have been elements of more inclusion and more acceptance after the war due to their large-scale deployment, it was far from an egalitarian society or a really big positive impact in the way people of color were perceived in France, if that answers your question.
Thanks. In about half an hour we will have a break, so then you will have more opportunities to question Annelore and Jan Eijsen and all of our speakers. So thank you very much once more.
Thank you.
And now we are going from Huis Doorn and from the Netherlands to German examples of provenance research. We have here Julia Bindner, and you're going to talk to us about the trends in post-colonial provenance research in Germany. Julia, you are a social anthropologist, so not a historian, but a social anthropologist with a background in theater, film, and media studies. And you're specialized in material culture, critical museum and heritage studies. You have worked also in numerous transdisciplinary settings, including art, historical and ethnological museums, and with a wide variety also of stakeholders from academia, art, activism, and cultural heritage communities. Dr. Bindner, I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you, Huis Doorn, for the kind invitation. Your Excellency, it's a great pleasure to learn about this exciting research project, and particularly about the research questions that Britta Schilling raised in the end about, how can we write or rewrite an entangled history, an entangled past. And being a social anthropologist myself and delving into different other disciplines that I would also like to share with you today. And we had a brief conversation what my talk should be all about. So I tried to give a brief overview of how provenance research into collections from colonial contexts has been shaped since about 2018 in Germany, and then give you really an idea how it feels like to actually work with these collections in a collaborative way with stakeholders, for example, from Namibia. And I would first like to make a point about how the narrative is shaped about colonial history here in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in Europe in general, and how it might be shaped and seen differently in other parts of the world. And that's what I would like to call fictitious public. So they're very different public discourses. The Humboldt Forum, I think, Dr. Anger, and you will talk about this very contested heritage site in Germany in the afternoon, a little bit later on. But it's safe to say that it's been one of the key factors why Germany is now suddenly dealing with its colonial past, or not dealing with its colonial past. It's been a very contested site because of how it's dealing with German history. Also, Dr. Angermann is going to talk about that, and particularly how the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art, part of the State Museums of Berlin, Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, have been dealing with the colonial entanglements of their collections. And you might know it from the news and for also public events like this, since it was known that the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art would move their collections and their presentations to the Humboldt Forum, to a rebuilt Prussian castle, the castle of the last emperor of Germany. There have been huge debates in the press, in academia, and also by activists like this. And you can see here an intervention in 2015, and the poster reads, "Schon Beutekunst betrachtet, have you looked at looted art today?" So it's been a very long, ongoing debate, and I think it all came to a first peak when in 2018, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, asked Felvincent and Bénédicte Savoy to write a report on what to do with collections from Africa. Should they be returned, and if so, how? Bénédicte Savoy, professor also at the TU in Berlin. She was also part of an international committee providing guidance for the Humboldt Forum, and she very famously left this board in order to also raise awareness of the ways in which she thought the Ethnological Museum, the Museum of Asian Arts, were not dealing with their colonial pasts. And then very quickly, in a very German, thorough manner, Germany took it upon itself to do something about that. And on the one hand, the German Lost Art Foundation, who had for several years already funded research into Nazi-era looted artworks, founded a new department for cultural goods and collections from colonial context. And since 2019, millions of euros have been spent in research projects on collections from colonial contexts. And on the other hand, that's, some of you might know it if you watch German TV. You can see Jan Böhmermann. He's a late-night comedian and a political commentator on national German television. And back then, in 2019, the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation were awarded 4 permanent provenance researchers for the collections of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin and the Museum of Asian Art. I was one of those very lucky, privileged persons to, and Jan Böhmermann, like, it was such a big politically heated debate that we even made it into Jan Böhmermann, and what he's showing us with his hand is like 4. It's 4 people for 500,000 objects, alone at the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, 500,000, 500,000, plus another 500,000 of sound recordings and photographs. So all in all, 4 permanent positions for 1 million cultural objects. So yes, we were very lucky, but it was also a very daunting task to have. And last but not least, there's also, for example, I mean, just to give you an example, the Deutscher Museumsbund, the Museum Association of Germany, they, together with colleagues, not just from Germany, but from the Global South, wrote guidelines for the care of cultural goods from colonial context. So it was a really wide-ranging initiative. To give you an idea, the box salute, colleagues of mine in Berlin, Christine Howald and Kerstin Panhorst, they've been leading a project on the box salute. So you might want to get into that. It's a big project with lots of partners in Germany, but also in China. And I think that's one of the main goals and ideals that provenance research in Germany has, that it is already collaborative, either be it on an institutional level or more community-based. There's another big project going on since 2015 in several iterations on the Machi War and the colonial loot that can also be found in the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, with the National Museum of Tanzania, with communities, with artists, so very broad. And then just to give you another example, the collection of Francis Laflèche. He was the First Nations anthropologist in the US, and he collected his own people, the culture of his own people, and this collection also ended up in Berlin, and a colleague of mine, Ila Labishinsky, together with the Omaha descendants of Francis Laflèche and the Omaha, have been working on how to deal with these collections and with these entangled pasts. But let's talk about Germany and Namibia. And that's a project that I've been involved in since 2018, when I started as a provenance researcher going into the collections from Namibia, 1,400 objects to be precise. And also there, I think it's really important to understand the public debate surrounding German-Namibian histories and their entangled pasts. Since very recently, there have been many protests, yearly protests by survivors of the genocide against the Oberherero and Nama in Berlin and other parts of Germany for the recognition of the war that escalated into a genocide, and also regarding the repatriation of human remains looted during this conflict. And I think this naming of names and this history of writing, or this way of historiography, which means writing a history of the perpetrators, or more generally speaking, the German actors of the entangled pasts, is something that is very important and that also clings to provenance research in Germany at least. We want to talk about our ways, that what we committed, the crimes that Germany and German actors committed in the colonies. Whereas in Namibia itself, there's quite a different movement than I've been experiencing. What you can see here is the artistic rendering of the removal of the so-called Reiterdenkmal in Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, in, now I can't read it, I hope, 2009. This Reiterdenkmal showed a German soldier on the horse, and it was erected right after the colonial war and genocide against the Oberherero and Nama at the city center of Windhoek. And only in 2009, the Namibian government decided to remove it, and this was documented by a German-Namibian artist, Nicola Brandt. And recently, in 2022, she continued her work together with other colleagues of hers, Namibian artists, where at the moment where another German memorial of the colonial period was to be dismantled, which was of Kurt von Francois. He was the founder of the German military troops, colonial troops in Namibia. And the artworks, the art series is called We Are Our Own Monuments, which is quite a telling story. So dismantling the colonial perpetrators and rewriting Namibian histories from Namibian perspectives. And up to this day, I'm not sure, Her Excellency, Ms. Kapanda and Giros can tell us more about it. It's the empty plinth that's still standing there. So there are two very different movements in time. In Germany, it's a time of reckoning, of recognizing what happened and naming names. And in Namibia, it's the other way. It's about re-Namibization of history. And it was in this context in which we, and I will show you a very long list of people. I was one of many who were part of this project. We conceived this project, and the project title already also talks about these different movements in time. It's about confronting colonial past, that was very much a need in the German team, and envisioning creative futures. That was very much how our Namibian partners approached this project. They bluntly told us, look, if you haven't dealt with your colonial past, do it, but we want to look into the future. These objects are our cultural belongings, and again, you know, not objects, but cultural belongings. So I think terminology is very key, what you mentioned before. And that's what we're in for, and that's why we're also committing to it. And there's a long list of, and it's becoming much longer since then. In 2018, the team at the Ethnological Museum, me as a provenance researcher and project coordinator, the curators, people in the depot bringing objects, the conservatives, etc., academic advisors, and then researchers from Namibia. The Ethnological Museum had an institutional partner, the Museums Association of Namibia, and it was them who were enabled to look for experts to invite to Germany. So it wasn't us picking people, but it was someone with a deep knowledge of the cultural landscape of Namibia. And what you see here is a first statistic overview of the Namibian collections. And we went in with the idea or the hypothesis that obviously it must have been the war that escalated into a genocide that was a context in which most objects had been looted. But as you can very clearly see, that's not the case. There were very early collections, which then also became a focal point for our Namibian research partners, stemming from missionary contexts, religious contexts, and then very few others. But you can see the narrative that is mostly known from the Benin bronzes, where you have one colonial war where the majority of treasures are looted, didn't apply. So it was for us to listen. And that's one key methodology that we try to develop further, is to listen and to understand our own needs, which is confronting colonial past, but listen very closely of the needs and interests of our research partners. And that was, it looks a little bit tidied up, but basically that's what we were doing. We were sitting around the table, if we were not looking at the artifacts themselves, and thought about, okay, how can we bring our needs together? And one key message that men brought with them, the Museums Association of Namibia, was that we don't want to see these collections just as a colonial archive. For us, it's an archive of Namibian fashion and design. And that's why we're not only inviting historians and curators, but also fashion designers, because we also want to find out what inspirations and what positive can come out of these colonial collections. And very briefly, I would like to give you one example of how we try to listen and also be open to other alternative forms of knowledge beyond the written colonial archives. And it's a story that began with a person, Cynthia Schimming, and with a doll like this. It's an object that's far removed from the precious treasures that you might find in the Emperor here in Huis Doorn. It's hand-sewn, it's 23 centimeters tall or small, and it was probably sewn by an Over-Herero girl at a missionary station whose name was not recorded. And when Cynthia Schimming, she was the grande dame of fashion in Namibia, that's why she was invited to come to study the collections with us. When she first came, and all we knew was that she was Over-Herero German, we were very delicate and said, okay, how we're going to approach her? It might be very difficult to come to Germany and research with us. And she was like what's the fuss all about? What's the politics? We had brought out some armbands and for her to see as first cultural belongings. And she was like, yes, we still have that, we're still creating them. And she took some out. I just bought them at the market as gifts for you to come. So like there was some, positive misunderstanding. And I learned a lot about historical techniques and fashion in Namibia. But everything changed when Cynthia Schimming met this doll. This doll was with her face lying down on a table, and Cynthia took her up and started cradling her like a baby. And from that point onwards, everything changed. I remember vividly coming back from the storage to our office, and at some point she turned to me and she said, I've never felt that angry in my life. I'm not sure if I can continue, but so many things have come up now, and yeah, I'm not sure how to continue. So one of the first questions she asked me was like, how come this doll is in Berlin? She remembered making a doll like this with her overhero grandmother, and as a child, this was her most precious possession. So she kept asking me, like, how come the possession of a child ends up in a Royal Imperial Museum in Berlin? So I went to the missionary archives in Wuppertal with the Rhenish missionaries and found images like these of so-called sewing schools, where young girls were taught how to dress differently via Christian European ideas of gender and body and dress. And very quickly, this doll for me became a tool for colonizing the body of children and women. And I came back with this information, and obviously with the name of a missionary who might have taken or bartered, as he claimed, this doll with him, and 139 other cultural belongings. And Cynthia said, stop, you can't tell the story like this. It's not just a story of victims. These young girls are not just victims. They infuse these dolls and the dresses that they made for themselves with their own sense of beauty and style. Look, for example, at someone like Lucrezia Canesha. She was a seamstress and care worker at the missionary station in the 1930s in Namibia. Look at her dress. And yes, you might want to see in her not just a sign of proof of missionization, because that's why the missionary took the photo, but it might also be Lucrezia Canesha voguing, showcasing her latest fashion creation. But the doll also touched on even more traumatizing experiences and also transgenerationally transmitted trauma. Cynthia also remembered asking her overhero grandmother why overhero women wear so many petticoats. And the answer was, because we didn't want to get raped. So this little doll also pointed to the trauma of violence committed against children and women during colonial war and genocide. And in re-entangling these stories and experiences with a doll from the 1870s, a time even before the official occupation of the country, also tells us a little bit of how we might have to question our ways of chronology and European historiography when we think about doing provenance research in an entangled way, as you mentioned before. And I'm personally very grateful that Cynthia, even though it was a also re-traumatizing process to work with us on these collections, she decided to create an art piece that's now on show at the Humboldt Forum. And it has two parts. One is a female figure wearing a very similar dress than the one that the doll is wearing, which is now has become a sign of a cultural sign for overhero women. Today, women wear very proudly these Victorian-style dresses with the big skirts and everything. And the second part is a stylized landscape. And we did workshops on colonialist photography in Namibia. And one feature of photography in Namibia was the fact that after the genocide, landscapes were often depicted empty. And these were then used as propaganda tool to attract settlers to the colony. And when Cynthia heard that, again, she got very angry and said, you know what, I'm going to repopulate the land of Namibia, with everyone that ever shaped and has been shaping Namibia to this day. And you can see here, there are portraits of Hendrik Witbooi and Samuel Maharero, anti-colonial heroes and fighters. There are also German militaries, and there are, here's the original photo, images like these of the many unnamed persons who haven't found a name, or if sometimes you can reconnect them as we found out. And the original caption reads, and now I have to go and see it, diamond mining, searching the field for mining worthiness. I mean, it's a very literal translation. And what it means was that in 1908, diamonds were found by accident while building the railroads from Lüderitz, port town, in then the German colony. And the survivors of the genocide who were imprisoned in so-called concentration camps were then used as forced laborers to build the infrastructure, but then also in search for these new natural resources, the diamonds. And this is an image of a piece from Huis Doorn. I haven't been there myself, but Her Excellency Dr. Kabanda Giros, she shared her experience of visiting Huis Doorn with me and showed me some pictures, and I immediately made the connection between 1908, German Southwest Africa, Deutsch Südwest, in July, memorializing the fact this the first finding of these diamonds, and then relating that back to ways in which colonialism was very much about the exploitation of land and people. And when you take a step back, you might see that this installation is in motion. This female figure presses her right arm against the side of the vitrine, and she grabs the land. And with that, she wants to break free, and she wants to take everything with her, the land, the history, and the people. I would quickly now turn to the restitution part of our project. From the very beginning, it was clear that our Namibian partners wanted to return some of the cultural belongings home. And in a very long process with stakeholders in Namibia, from communities to activists to academics and museum professionals, they selected a small number of cultural belongings for the first pilot project of how to return cultural belongings in a more sustainable and also just manner. Those are the 23 cultural belongings. The little doll that Cynthia chose, she gave her own Oshi Herero name, Watunwa, which means touched. And in the exhibition at the Humboldt Forum, Cynthia asks whose hands have touched this doll and whose hands have touched the many women in Namibia. And there are so many stories to all of these other cultural belongings that I can't go into detail with. But what might be interesting of you is that as you already saw, a lot of these cultural belongings were not taken from classical colonial war contexts, and so the legal justifications for their return were not just colonial injustice or looting, they were cultural and historical significance that our Namibian partners attributed to these cultural belongings, and as well as contexts like the genocide. And then in May of 2022, the symbolic gestures and politics of restitution took place first in Berlin. You can see here the president of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, Professor Partzinger, the general director of the National Museum of Namibia, Ms. Esther Mombola Gorgoses, the Namibian ambassador. So again, very representative contexts where these cultural belongings that already had made so many reconnections made their journey back home. And in Namibia, at the Independence Memorial Museum, there was an even bigger press conference with many stakeholders, with many questions about what the future of these cultural belongings might be. And you again see, for example, Cynthia Schimming with Professor Parzing and Professor Koch, the head of the Ethnological Museum. And I will come to the future of these belongings in a minute. But beyond these, the noise, I might say, of the restitution gestures, there was Cynthia at the National Museum of Namibia welcoming home Watunwa. And I'm very sad that unfortunately Cynthia Schiming passed away only 3 weeks after this. But there is a generation of young artists, scholars, community members who are taking up these reconnections with the cultural belongings. This is one example, Pete Tovisho-Kato, a contemporary artist who in her own work has also already worked with dolls and the importance of dolls, which is obviously much more than just toys, in over Herero society. And now I come to the re-entanglement part in Namibia. Our Namibian partners have designed a very broad, very multi-perspective ways in which these objects, cultural belongings, are now welcomed home. One is contemporary artists working with these collections. The other is community researchers who really root the reconnection in the community itself. So it's not just the National Museum going to communities, extracting information and then doing an exhibition. It's really about learning what the needs of people in also rural areas in Namibia are and how to reconnect them with them. There are scholarships at the University of Namibia enabling young scholars to also do their new historiographies with these collections and many more. And when you look at this picture, that's a workshop in Okombahe under a tree in Namibia with images at this point, but our Namibian partners are working on that maybe at some point the actual cultural belongings will also will be with them in the regions. One might come to rethink this notion of the museum as contact zone that's so often invoked, where, as we all know, museums have certain limitations, but also certain potentials. And maybe that's another way of rethinking the contact zones, particularly when thinking about restitutions and reconnections. We might be able to expand what museum is like and our knowledge of our entangled past. And I would like to give a nod to the many, many institutional partners and the even more people working within these, and particular our 2 funding bodies without whom none of this could have happened, the Gerda Henkel Foundation and the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Many thanks.
Are there any questions? Yeah, all in the back. There's a mic behind you. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Peter Gunning. I did my thesis on the heritage of the genocide in Namibia. And not so much a question, but just I love the analysis of the doll and how the post-colonial and the colonial period is more than just 2-dimensional, that it's not a pre and a post period, and that there's more than one interpretation through the doll. And I think it might also be true with the physical heritage, the monuments, because otherwise then it seems that the removal of the monuments is therefore a clear-cut post-colonial interpretation. But I used to go to school every day past that museum, and people protested against the removal of those statues, despite the fact that they are of German heritage. And my practical question is, does your project also work with human remains, or are they all, is it just the fabrics and the objects? Because I know that in Namibia that was another tricky sticking point. So it would be interesting to hear if the human remains were also be able to go back to their heritage and their ancestors. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the question. That is exactly the question that came up in Berlin in Windhoek at the press conferences. As this project originated at the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, and the Ethnological Museum doesn't hold human remains, ancestral remains. This was not part of the project. There has been several waves of repatriations of human remains from Germany to Namibia. And as far as we know, in Berlin at least, all human remains from Germany have been repatriated. But that doesn't mean the rest of the country. So obviously there are hundreds, if not thousands, of human remains still in German collections. Yes. And there are several projects looking into that as well.
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your very interesting story. I would like to go to the organization of the Provenance research. And if I listen to researchers in the Global South, you hear two things. We want to have our own research community, and we want to decide ourselves about the narrative of our country's culture and history. And my question is, to what extent does the approach you are practicing in Berlin contribute to enabling former colonies to create their own research communities and to tell their own narratives?
Thank you so much. It's a complicated question, so to say. A project can only do so much. And I think one of the key factors is part of restitution is also to enabling former colonized people to rewrite their own history with new resources. I mean, these cultural belongings, they are materialized histories, and we can tell our German version or Namibian, Tanzanian, and within that, there are so diverse societies from many different perspectives, these stories. And besides that, one of the claims that our partners from Namibia always said was like, it's not just about the physical objects. They have to come with something, because as you saw, colonialism was not just about looting of cultural artifacts, it's about robbing land, it's about extracting resources, it's about exploiting people, and also destroying social and cultural fabrics of society. And this has repercussions up until today. So just the physical return of cultural belongings might not be enough. And that's why we also designed this very ongoing project, and we raised funds with German funding bodies, quite considerable funds, to make all of this happen. What I didn't mention, for example, this pilot project also looked at what does Namibia need to actually be able to ask for more returns, which means, is there even a building to house returned cultural belongings before they might go to the communities? So, is there a conservator who also has the knowledge of how these cultural belongings were treated in Germany? Because fact is that historically, most of these objects were treated with pesticides like arsenic or DDT, highly toxic substances. So what we bring back or give back is also toxic legacies. And people have to know about that and might also need the skills. And then they're like, yes, we never intoxicated these cultural belongings, so you have to bring certain gloves and facilities. And it's also about capacity building, but not as a lack of knowledge, but of something that we did to these cultural belongings that also we have to make right in order to actually physically return these cultural belongings. So it's a very broad process.
Thank you, Julia. We've come to the end of this session. We are going to have a brief moment where we can have a cup of coffee. It's in Zaal 1636, in Hall 1636, at the beginning of this corridor. But firstly, since Ms. Wolfensberger is going to leave us, I would like to give Herman the opportunity to thank her. So we have a 15-minute break in the end of this hallway where you can have a cup of coffee. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to proceed. Thank you for turning back to this amazing symposium already so far, but it's far from finished. We still have a couple of super interesting presentations for you. And we will start with the second session now, which is about examples from two museums, stories from Beijing to Berlin. So actually we're gonna hear about the last German emperor and his Chinese art objects. We already heard a bit about it by Anne de Flore. But now we have invited Dr. Qingling Wang. He is curator of the Chinese art in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and his research focuses on the subjects of Chinese literary painting, Ming and Qing Queen court arts, and the issues of artistic exchanges between China and Europe. Dr. Qingling Wang, I would like to give you the floor. And I would also like to ask you to speak very, well, basically kiss the mic so that everybody can hear the speakers well.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you very much. So, it is my pleasure to have this honor to speak in this conference. And Kaiser Wilhelm II was one of my old subjects 10 years ago when I was working on my PhD. So it is a very nice opportunity for me also to review the history. So I will start my presentation now. So today I'm going to talk about some important Chinese art object that is in Kaiser Wilhelm II's possession. So, as we all know, the interest of object is this six lacquer panel that in Huis Doorn collection. So earlier we also heard about the subject. So the subject is about the pacification of Taiwan. So this is very interesting art project that was made during Emperor Qianlong's reign. So the pacification of Taiwan is a set of painting and copperplate engraving project made by the Qing court by the imperial workshop, depicting the battle of the Qing army to conquer or pacify the Lin Shuangwen rebellion during 1787 to 1788. The Lin Shuangwen rebellion that broke out in November 1786 was the largest civil uprising during the Qing dynasty in Taiwan, and it was not pacified until February 1788. So it took about 1 year and 3 months to seize this rebellion. First, Emperor Qianlong did send the reinforcement to try to seize the rebellion, but they failed. So eventually, he had to send his one of his favorite commander, Fu Kan'an, across the strait and bring in 120 elite Manchu Baturu, and also over 9,000 specially chosen soldiers across China. So here we see a painting version and also the copperplate version. So the painting, so if we dive into the imperial archive of imperial workshop, we'll be able to reconstruct the precision, the process of making these two series. So the painting series was completed in 1789. So in the second month, in the 53rd years of Qianlong's reign, which is 1788, Qianlong ordered Fu Kan'an to hire local painters in Taiwan to document the important battles and also the geographical landscape, etc. And later, Fukanang sent back 16 sketches in 2 goes. And these sketches were the study or the foundation for Emperor Qianlong's core painter to recreate the series in the imperial workshop. So Qianlong Emperor valued this project very much, so he appointed 7 court painters to produce this project. And also, among the 16 sketches sent back by Fukanang, he decided for 10, and then he asked specifically the court painter Yao Wenhan and Miu Bingtai to draft the scene number 11 and 12. So this painting version was also the basis for the copperplate engraving, and was the copperplate engraving was happening in 1792, and immediately when the painting version was finished, this painting was already sent to the imperial workshop as the to make the preparation for the engraving onto the copperplate. So, and what is very important is that the Pacification of Taiwan was the first Chinese self-made copperplate engraving print series. Before that, the Chinese artists or the artisans used woodblock print to imitate the engraving texture. So each print has Emperor Qianlong's colophon, and these colophons was inscribed during 1787 to 1789. Therefore, the print series was completed after 1789, and also the first copperplate was ready in the new year of 1790 until the very last one was finished in 1792. In total, Emperor Qianlong printed out 200 copies to give it to officers and also royal family members. So now we have the first version, which is the base of the copperplate, and then we have the copperplate, and we have the printed version, the engraving printed version, and also then the lacquer panel. So, but what is the foundation, or what is the prototype of the lacquer panel? Is it based on the painted version, or is it based on the copperplate engraving version? So here we can see a comparison, and we can see, especially when is there a pointer here? So we can see when the artists try to depict the smoke, so the spigade form, it is very, very close to what it is depicted in the copperplate engraving. But what we need to bear in mind is carving on the lacquer panel, it is almost like building up a relief, which is very, very different and much, much more difficult than carving on the copperplate. But when is the lacquer panel was made, and also who made it? So unfortunately, if we try to dive into the imperial the archive of Imperial Workshop, we wouldn't find any answer or any clue. However, on the inventory of the tribute list dated in 1795, we saw a list of tributing 12 carved lacquer panel by a local officer. So Qifeng, which we then know, these 12 lacquer panels were not produced by the imperial workshop in court, but in Suzhou in 1795. Which is a location that is famous for its lacquer production based on the engraving print. They are the tributes of to the emperor for the Chinese New Year from the local officer. Also, the archive of Imperial Workshop also indicated Qianlong Emperor personally in favor this kind of carved lacquer. So starting from 1740s, Suzhou workshops already received numerous design or sketches from Imperial workshops to produce the product for the Imperial court. And archives also shows that in 1792, Qifeng was given a set of engraving prints of the pacification of Taiwan. Therefore, this is his return gift to the Chinese emperor. So the whole set of 12, we now know 11 pieces. So the first one was in Berlin collection in the Museum of Asian Art, and the second, and the Huis Doorn has 6, and there's also one in America private collection, and this one is in the America private collection, and number 10 and 11 is in private collection, although we don't know where they are, but they can be traced in the early 20th century auction catalog. And the mystery number 12, until so far, we don't know, but it should look like this. So what is so special about this lacquer panel? If we look very, very carefully, they are not entirely red. So this lacquer panel was high quality made and very nicely carved, also in 3 different colors. So the artisans used the red lacquer to depict the figures, landscape, and trees and mountains, and he used the lacquer artisan used the yellow to depict the land, and also black or dark green to depict sky and water. Also, around it, the frame of the lacquer panel was made from sandalwood, and on the sandalwood is all different kind of inlays with gemstones and dyed ivories. So very, very fine detail work. So these panels are going to be shown in Huis Doorn in April. So I would really highly recommend to go and have a look. And besides these lacquer panels, Kaiser Wilhelm II also have an extraordinary painting. This painting is exceedingly large, bigger than my apartment, basically. So the height of this painting is 5 meters tall, and the width is 10. So it is semi 50 square meters. And this painting was given to the Museum of Ethnology in 1902 as a long-term loan from Kaiser Wilhelm II. And since the Kaiser moved to Netherlands, later it automatically became a museum's collection. And now, in the newly opened Humboldt Forum, this painting is permanently displayed in the gallery. And about this painting, I have wrote a whole book of it, so I'm not going to spend much more time on this. However, we can identify the original provenance of this painting, and through the archive of Imperial Workshop, we be able to relocate it, the origin space, and also when this painting was made. And archive told us that this painting was hung in the temple of Wanshandian, which is in the western garden of the Forbidden City, and is where the red area is. And this area now is impossible to access because it is now the Chinese Communist Party political headquarters. And together, the lacquer panel, through the archive, we can also find its original provenance. So the red lacquer panel and the portrait of soldiers and generals, and also the copper plate engraved, so the copper plate that was used for the engraving were all stored in the palace of Ziguangge, literally translated the hall of purple glens. And that is also located in the western garden on the other side of the lake. And this place was established in the Ming Dynasty, and it was the place where the imperial court hold the martial exams. And later in the Qing Dynasty, it became the place where emperor invite the soldiers and generals for the victory banquet. And nowadays, it was used by the Chinese Communist Party as the reception for the diplomatic guests. So, all these objects came to Germany around the same time, like the period of 1900 to 1902. And this is very likely related to the Box Rebellion happening in 1899. What caused the conflict between China and the foreign powers was on 1900, the German diplomat Clement von Kettler was killed on its way to the Zongli Siwu Yamen, officer in charge of affairs of all nations. And this was the next day, June 21, and following an ultimatum from Western powers, Empress Dowager Cixi declared a state of war on the 11 nations, which is including Britain, America, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Russia, Austria, Hungary, Spain, Holland, and Belgium. In the name of Guangxi Emperor, at the same time, the court offered a reward to anyone catching and killing foreigners, immediately sending Beijing into chaos. And the foreign powers also formed a line to siege the Beijing. So the death from the Kettler presented the foreign powers with an opportunity to invade China. It was an especially good excuse for the German imperial government to threaten and blackmail the Qing government. Following von Kettler's death, William II resolved to take vengeance on China. He sent the German East Asian Expedition Corps. So, an army commanded by General Alfred von Wadersee, who was elected Allied Supreme Commander, and he set sail to in the Empire of China. Although by the time the force arrived in China, the campaign was already over. However, before the sailing, Kaiser Wilhelm II also made a very famous speech called Hunerede, which was given on July 27th, 1900, and he commended his soldiers in the spirit of the Huns to be merciless in battle, and it is very juicy. So I highlighted it in red. He says, "You are to revenge. It is all the more outrageous that this crime has been committed by a nation that takes pride in its ancient culture." So when you encounter him, know this. No quarter will be given. Prisoners will not be taken. Exercise your arms such that for 1,000 years no Chinese will dare to look across at a German. And in the Rijksmuseum collection, we also have an old historical photo of the execution of the leader of the Boxers' rebellion in China. So, in fact, William II's aggressive sentence towards China was clear long before this speech. In January 1898, soon after Germany occupied Jiaozhou Bay, the English journal Punch published a caricature titled "A New Role," like William II is dreaming become the new Chinese emperor. So, although the depiction is somewhat exaggerated, there is no doubt that it reveals not only the ambition of German imperialism to build a colonial empire in northeastern China in the late 19th century, but William II was instigator of his grand plan. And before von Wadersee arrived to China, he already indicated that he wanted to have his headquarters at Emperor Dowager Cixi's palace. And when he arrived, the occupation was becoming a complete loot and very messy. So according to the historical writing, there are different writing from American, English, French, and also Chinese. So they all describe at this time, it is like heaven and earth were turning upside down. So this is the historical background surrounding the Allied looting. Now I will focus on details related to this loot. So the Wadersee moved the headquarters to this place, so which is also very close to the temple of Wanshandian and the temple of Ziguangge, which where the lacquer panel and the big painting coming from. So before von Wadersee moved, to Cixi Dowager's Paris area, it was the Russian occupation zone. And that was already been looted, but it doesn't stop the further looting. And in his dispatch to Wilhelm II, he says, here, it's very long, I would only read here. Your Majesty may feel assured that I am insisting that everything which has been taken possession of by Germany shall be preserved intact. He further also writes in his diary, he says, the Kaiser made the expedition the basis of great hopes for the development of our trade with Eastern Asia. He also impressed it on me that as big a war indemnity as possible should be imposed on the Chinese, as he was needing money urgently for the fleet. Soon, when he arrived, when von Badersee arrived China, he already put his eyes or notice on the astronology instruments on the ancient observatory. And this observatory was built in 1442 and was one of the oldest observatories in the world. And it was used by Ming and Qing astronomers to make astrological reports for the emperor. So Badersee wanted this object and also the French. So in the end, they distributed and separated and shared the loot. And this act was protested by the American commander, but Badersee decided to ignore. So here is the object that was divided by the German and the French. Soon, this astronomical instrument was shipped back to Berlin and was placed in the garden of Orangerie Schloss in Potsdam. And the French army moved the instruments to the French embassy and displayed them in the garden as the memorial to their victory during the war in China. In 1902, the instruments were given back to Chinese government following the pressure of the public opinion. And because of the Boxer Rebellion and the siege of Beijing from the foreign powers, in 1901, China signed a so-called the Boxer Protocol, or 辛丑合约, with 11 nations that Cixi Dawaja declared the wars. And basically there's two conditions. One, there should be a memorial or monument built to note this, the death of von Kettler. So there is a monument built, but this monument was also going through several changes. In 1918, following the defeat of Germany in World War I, and this monument was changed its name, called the Victory of Justice Gate, or the Victory Memorial. And in 1953, on the occasion of the Asian Pacific Peace Conference in Beijing, it was renamed once again as the Protection of Peace Gate. And the other condition was that the Chinese imperial court should send out a delegation to Germany and to apologize for this event. So the 18-year-old Prince Chun went as the representative of China and went to Germany on September 8th, 1901. The embassy led the Prince Chun arrive Berlin and brought numerous gifts from the imperial collection to the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II. And So the press, Das kleine Journal, also reported this event and described the objects and the gift that Prince brought. And on the slides, we see one of the objects now in Munich collection. At that time, Kaiser Wilhelm II distributed all those objects in 2 different museums' collection. So, following the defeat of World War I, under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the instruments were to be returned to China. So this happened in June 1920, and they arrived in Beijing in April 1921. Also, because of the defeat, Germany's defeat in World War I, Wilhelm II, his support declined. So eventually, he left Germany and moved to Utrecht in 1920. And so here we see the astronomical instrument back to the Chinese ancient observatory.
Dr. Wang, could you wrap up?
Almost 2 slides. So very interestingly, with the same provenance, like the lacquer panel, there's also this kind of generous portrait, and these objects were mainly in German collections, with a few in America and also a few in France. Take the Berlin Museum of Völkerkunde, so Ethnological Museum, as example. They acquired 33 these kind of portrait in the first half of 20th century as the collection. However, these objects was also looted by the Russian Red Army during the World War II, and so far we only know 3 were kept in St. Petersburg, and the rest 30 portraits are still unknown. So, conclusion. In 2021, the Museum of Asian Art moved into the Humboldt Forum in the city center of Berlin. The lacquer panels, the painting, the Buddha preaching, and other objects now can finally be seen and displayed in public and also accessible. The Boxer Rebellion of 1899 led to a Western military response and an occupation in parts of Beijing. It was at this time that the lacquer panels, the painting, and the portrait arrived Germany, sorry. And in the process of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the archive established that the lacquer panels, the painting, and other objects were not included in official war reparations and do not appear to have been traded. Whether or not they were looted during the Boxer Rebellion requires further investigation. However, when we think of how this object ended up in Berlin, this historical context should not be omitted. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Qingling Wang. And you already made the bridge actually to our next speaker, to the Humboldt Forum. The next speaker is Alfred Hagemann, and he's going to talk about the Emperor, the Berlin Palace, and German colonialism. Dr. Alfred Hagemann is head of the Department of History of the site, the history of the site, at the Stiftung Humboldt Forum in Berlin, and he studied art history and English at Halle and Berlin. His research focuses on the architectural and cultural history of the Berlin court in the 18th century. I need to be precise here. and state self-representation of the German Democratic Republic. And over the past 15 years, Hagemann has created a number of exhibitions on the history of Prussia and the German Democratic Republic in Berlin and in Potsdam. I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Excellencies. Thank you for having me. And I'm very honored to speak in this very symbolic and historic place for Netherlandish history. And I will speak about a place of great symbolic meaning to Germany. So this is real. In Berlin, we have a fake. I'm also very lucky in speaking at this point of the conference because many things I wanted to express my learned colleagues have already said, so I can really connect to many things that have already been said. If I speak here as a German scholar in English in a Netherlandish conference about William II, then this catches quite nicely as well the life of William II with his British mother and the long time he lived in exile in the Netherlands, but it also shows the range, the international range of the topic we are approaching here today. And I think as colonialism is very much a European concept and something European states inflicted on pretty much the rest of the world, it is quite helpful that we speak about these topics in an international and European connection. I speak here today on, oh, I haven't shown my picture there. I speak here today on behalf of the Humboldt Forum and in my capacity as the head of the Department History of the site. The Humboldt Forum is, as we have heard today, and as you may be aware, a highly controversial and ambivalent project. It is controversial for two main reasons. For one thing, it's the architecture. This is the very heart of Berlin, the capital of Germany again since 1990, and also the capital of Prussia and the German Empire. And in this place stood, before the Humboldt Forum, another highly symbolic building of East Germany, the Palace of the Republic. And the German government decided about 20 years ago to replace this symbolic building of the East German government by a reproduction of the palace of the Prussian kings and German emperors that had been destroyed in 1950. So you see in this place we have replaced symbolic buildings in rather a speedy way. So what parts of our history do we remember as Germans in this place, in the capital, in the center of the capital? Who decides which parts of history to replace by what kind of pictures and images of history, and why? And that's a question which in itself has engaged German public discussing about German history very much, let alone all the international connections we have to deal with too, because the second highly controversial thing about the Humboldt Forum is its contents, because for a long time it was not quite clear what to put behind the facades of a reconstructed palace, and German government in the end decided to put into this new building behind the facades of a reconstructed palace the Museum for Ethnology and the Museum for Asian Art. And at some point it became quite clear that it's maybe quite a bad idea to present cultural belongings that had been in many cases looted in a colonial context behind the facades of a building that represents symbolically, at least, the very German Empire that had looted them in the first place. So you can imagine trying to explain to our visitors the history of this site is quite a handful. And for us, in the history of the site, of course, the German side of the story and the international side of the story are interconnected very closely. So we have to look at this place as the site of Prussian and German monarchy. For 500 years, the Hohenzollerns have built on this site. We have to look at it in terms of East and West German history and relations, and the collections placed into the building force us to interconnect the history of these collections with the history of the site. So what we actually try to do is to reintegrate colonial history of Germany by example of this site. And colonial history in Germany, as we have heard already earlier, is something German society has avoided for many decades to actually engage with. So obviously the relationship of monarchy, the palace as the seat of monarchy, and the role of monarchy in German colonialism is extremely relevant for us at the history of the site. I will try to give you in the next few minutes an insight in our work concerning especially the late 19th and early 20th century colonial history of the site with a focus on William II. I will just say that of course we are also dealing with colonial contexts of the 17th and 18th centuries, but in the context of this conference I will clearly concentrate on William II. We have already heard that until recently the interest in William II had focused very much on a question for the last 100 years actually, that is his responsibility for the outbreak of World War I. So for 100 years it has been discussed what power the emperor really wielded within the constitutional framework of the German Empire. Interest in his role in Germany's colonial past, however, was rather marginal until very recently. And this is, of course, no coincidence. As I said, in general, we have to speak of a colonial amnesia in Germany, public historical awareness. So while scholars have worked on colonial history of Germany for decades, a broader public has really got interested only recently, and maybe the Humboldt Forum and the debate about the Humboldt Forum has triggered something there. About 10 years ago, the first books started to emerge that actually looked at the role of the emperor in German colonial history, especially in Southwest Africa. And I'll show you some of the most important books in this context. And it is maybe no coincidence that most of these books were written in English by English-speaking authors, with few exceptions. These works give us already a much deeper understanding of William's radius of action and political beliefs, so the authors do not agree on the amount of William's influence. But from the point of view of history of the site, there's still lots to do, because these historians did not actually focus on the role the Berlin Palace played as a site of colonial histories. This is something we try to do now ourselves. In 2022 to 23, we were happy to collaborate with Jonas Kreinbaum, the author of the aforementioned books, and on our behalf, he looked into the role of William II and the Berlin Palace for German colonial history. His results will be published in a German journal in a couple of months. And I think I can draw very much on Dr. Schilling's idea of the colonial worldview of William to explain what we are trying to do. And it is not difficult to convince an art historian like me that looking at objects and their contextualization and their use in interiors is a way of understanding how meaning is created apart from looking at the actual data in archives of the Foreign Office. So one of the questions we focused on was to look at the Berlin Palace as a venue of diplomatic visits of dignitaries from colonized countries who were who wanted, in many cases, to meet the Kaiser and who were, in some cases, received in the palace. So what would they see? How would they be received in the palace? One of the visits we were interested in was the visit of Friedrich Maharero in 1896, because the circumstances are quite telling. He was the son of Samuel Maharero, who a couple of years later would lead the uprising against the German colonizers in what is today Namibia. And we heard already that in the course of this war, the German troops committed the terrible genocide on the Herero and Nama people. But at the time, in 1896, when Friedrich Maharero came to Berlin, the family was still on relatively good terms with the German administrations of what the Germans then called German Southwest Africa. His wish to send his son to Berlin was part of his strategy to be accepted as an important political factor in the colony. While the German governor supported the idea of Friedrich being received by the Kaiser in Berlin, there was very little interest actually in this visit. And only when Governor Leutwein told the Berlin authorities that Friedrich Maharero was prepared to pay for the journey himself, the Berlin administration answered they would try to make it possible for Friedrich to meet William. So Friedrich and his entourage of people went on this journey without actually knowing if they would achieve their goal in meeting the emperor. What he knew was that he would be part of the so-called Colonial exhibition in Berlin in 1896, and this is something that was already touched upon in other talks. This exhibition in Berlin was part of a very large industrial exhibition that was held in Berlin in that year and which drew several million visitors. The Colonial exhibition was part of a propaganda show really to encourage colonial ideas within the German public, and it featured representations of villages in Africa and Oceania and presented people from the colonies in typical surroundings. So these racist human zoos, how one must really call them, was a custom at the time in Europe and the US, and it was, as I said, part of a propaganda for colonization and European conceptions of superiority. And it's hard to imagine, actually, that Friedrich Maharero came to Berlin as a representative of a territory that was supposed to be part of the empire and was exhibited in this humiliating way for several weeks before he actually was received by the emperor. The meeting with William in the end was very short. It was half an hour in the private apartment of the emperor. And obviously the officials and this court had made every possible move to make it as little official as possible. So it was by no means a state visit. And you can tell that also by the press echo. There was very much in the newspapers about this colonial exhibition of people, and especially Friedrich Maharero's role in this exhibition was mentioned in the newspapers. That he was received by the Kaiser was just mentioned in 2 meager lines in the newspaper. So while Friedrich and his father had aimed to be recognized as representatives of their people in Berlin, what actually happened was that they were recognized only as being something exotic to be exhibited in a show. And maybe this humiliation was one first step for the family to understand that a respectful cooperation with the Germans was not to be expected, and maybe this is one of the reasons for his turn against German colonial politics later on. I will not go into the details about William's role for the genocide. We have heard something about it. I just want to say one thing. I mean, we can discuss for another 100 years how to interpret the way William dealt with Lothar von Trotha, and if he was envisaging a genocide when he appointed him, but we can actually see that he did nothing against it when it happened. So in any way, Wilhelm takes the full responsibility as the head of the state in which this terrible crime was committed. And drawing on again on what you were saying about the world view of the Kaiser, we can be very clear that he had a racist and colonialist worldview, and this is something which you can very much see in the language that was used, not only in Wilhelm's writing and the way he talked, but also in the people that surrounded him. So the extreme violence that is expressed in the language, I think, is important to understand the kind of setting that made the actual crimes possible. And looking at this language, it is obvious that it is too easy, actually, for the German public to think, well, Wilhelm is to blame, but you really have to understand that it was the whole administration, the whole political system that actually made these colonial crimes possible. And of course, Wilhelm was a key factor in this whole system, as his language was very, very prominent. If he talked, people listened. So if he used this kind of really brutalizing language, if we read of elimination, termination, with regard to people, it is obvious that the brutalization of the things that happened are very much his responsibility, at least two. And this is something you can see for Namibia, and this is something which you can also see with respect to what I'm not calling Boxer War anymore, but the war against the rightful and harmonious fists. I can skip a lot of what I wanted to say about this war in Beijing and the looting of Beijing, because we have heard already a lot about it. But I just want to add one aspect, which is, we already heard that the infamous Han speech was one, again, verbal way of Wilhelm to really induce the brutalization, and this kind of language certainly made the soldiers that looted Beijing feel they were doing what was expected of them. And the looting was not enough for the emperor, so as we heard, he insisted on a Chinese delegation to come to Germany to officially apologize for what had happened. And interestingly, this delegation was not received in Berlin Palace, but in Potsdam, which was not the official residence of the German emperor, but was, in fact, a summer residence. So this, again, seems to show a certain pattern that these delegations in a colonial context were deliberately not received in the main palace or received not in a form of a state visit. And I can go quickly over the next picture because you heard the story already. One aspect I want to stress is that the delegation of the Chinese prince who came to Potsdam actually had their living quarters in the Orangery Palace. So I don't need to say much how humiliating and how spiteful it is of the German hosts to make the Chinese delegation walk past these looted objects from Beijing when they went to their living quarters. So I think we have to look in the second part of my talk, and I have a few minutes left, to Berlin Palace itself, to look at how it actually looked like. We are still at the beginning of this because working with historians, they often are not very trained in looking at objects. That's what art historians are for. So we are trying to piece together our different possibilities. We have already heard that many official and high-ranking colonial political events did not take place in Berlin Palace, and this is also true for the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884-85, which did not happen in Berlin Palace, but in the Wilhelmstraße in the Chancellery, so in a political context. Berlin Palace, of course, had state apartments called Paradekammern, and they were used for the grandest occasions in normal circumstances, like the opening of the Reichstag, and they were otherwise open to the public. They were tourist places to go. So they consequently would have been the ideal place, or were the ideal place, to represent the self-understanding of the empire and the dynasty. And already when the palace was built in the 18th century, you find, of course, an iconography that relates to certain European worldviews. So, for example, you have the representation of the world by allegories of the continents, and they show a pattern which is very common in Europe since the 16th century. They show Europe as a queen, or Athena in this case, throning, surrounded by weapons and by objects of science, and Europe is shown as ruling the world, whereas other continents are shown in a victimizing way. Here, this example shows Africa, a dead woman, which obviously was killed by this line. So we have this kind of imagery which shows, of course, European structures of thinking, of superiority, which are the basis of colonial thought, of course, but they are not very specific in terms of representation of real colonial possessions of the German Empire. And looking on the imagery in the rest of the palace, I was really quite surprised that I found actually nothing. In 1893, the emperor had the perfect opportunity when the main hall of Berlin Palace was redecorated, so it would have been the moment to show the German Empire as a colonial empire spanning several continents, but it did not happen. The White Hall was decorated purely in a dynastic way. It only showed dynastic symbolism, heraldry, portraits of former Hohenzollerns. This is even more surprising if you look at many places in Berlin outside the palace where you find a lot of colonial imagery and allusions to colonial politics. So this is a random example from a building in Berlin. You see two naked women which are supposed to represent Africa and Asia. So this is racist and sexist. And in between them is a European merchant ship, and underneath are two medieval European armed soldiers. So there is clearly this context of colonial exploitation of the world by military force and by, of course, economic interest. But looking in the palace, as I said, there is no concrete imagery which relies or relates to the colony. So what we can do, and I'm nearly there, is to look at the actual apartments of the emperor and his wife. Because the parade rooms are one side of the palace, the official side, but how did the emperor actually live? And there, of course, the connection to Huis Doorn is so interesting for us, because looking at all these small things he possessed maybe gives us a better clue. But we have several problems when trying to understand how the flats looked like. The inventories burned in 1945, and before 1918, very few photographs were actually taken from the flats of the emperor and his wife, because they were the private apartments. So we don't have photographs of every room. What we see is a very crowded, typical 19th century interior. And again, and that's the third problem, these apartments were cleared out after 1918. Not only because 64 wagon loads of stuff went to Doorn, where you still are laden with it, but also because the Weimar Republic, the new democratic government, had no interest in showing the imperial apartment as something nostalgic where you would go to see how the emperor had lived. So they cleared these rooms out. They made them pieces of art by reconstructing Baroque or, in this case, classicist rooms. So on the one picture, you see how the emperor lived, and on the other hand, you see how it looked in the 1920s. So trying to understand how the emperor surrounded himself and what he presented to his guests when he received them, we still have a lot to do to understand this. And so for me today, and the connection to Huis Doorn is so valuable because we can start pooling our resources and our knowledge to understand better where these things which are in Doorn now had their place in Berlin. And one example is this elephant's foot. This is the first result of our talks. You can just see it standing there. And it's the only object, looking at the few photographs we have, which immediately says colonial. But interestingly, things are never as easy as you think. This thing comes actually from Thailand, one of the few countries that was never colonized. But it was shot. The poor animal was shot by Otto Ehlers, and he was not only a traveler, but he was a great German, not in a positive sense, a great German colonial propagandist. And he presented the emperor with this elephant's foot, and it is now in Doorn. And it's so interesting because Ehlers collected extensively objects or cultural belongings, as I should say, in Naga, in the north of India. And this collection of Naga cultural belongings is now in the Humboldt Forum. So even this is not a typically colonial object, it is related to Otto Ehlers, and we are in the middle of it again. And so I think it's a very good example how finding out stories behind single objects, as you did in your project, will give us a much better understanding how everything around the palace, the royal family, the collections is connected, because one other thing we really have to do is to look into the relations between the emperor and the, as it was called then, Völkerkunde Museum, because we do not yet understand why did the emperor give what things directly to the museums and what did he keep in his own flat. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hageman. I'm afraid we have no time for questions now, but again, I'm sure during the drinks in 45 minutes, we will have ample opportunity to ask questions. But thank you once again. We are going from the museum collections and all the opportunities, but also challenges that we have there confronting their colonial past. We are going to, well, Germany as a whole. How does Germany deal with its colonial past? And for that, we invited Our Excellency Ambassador Cyril Noon to speak about this theme. Cyril Noon has been working in the German Foreign Office since 1985, and he was posted, among others, in Tehran, Rome, and before moving to Germany's permanent representation in the European Union in Brussels. And after 4 years spent at the Federal Chancellery in Berlin, he assumed positions in Tel Aviv and as a deputy head of the Office of Foreign Ministry. He was, among others, the German ambassador in Islamabad, in Pakistan, in Baghdad, in Iraq, and in Cairo, in Egypt, but now he assumed his present position in The Hague. Mr. Noon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear Mr. Sietsma, Excellency, dear Mikondro, good to see you here, distinguished participants and guests. Let me first congratulate Museum Huis Doorn for organizing a symposium dedicated to the last German emperor's colonial art and to connect it with Provenance research. And let me start also with an admission. It was said by some of you, a real and comprehensive debate on Germany's colonial past has been delayed for far too long. And in many respects, we are only at the beginning. For decades, Germany's colonial past was a non-issue, you said that, both in society and in various German federal governments. The description colonial amnesia describes it quite well, and for a long time, a false image was painted of Germany as a comparatively small and harmless colonial power, which is not true. Our country played a crucial and also a dark role, causing tremendous suffering in different parts of the world. At the same time, I would like to emphasize that this is no longer the case. Today, Germany recognizes its historical responsibility and is consistently working on coming to terms with its colonial past. The corresponding political will is reflected in the fact that this objective, coming to terms with the colonial past, is enshrined in written as a goal of the current coalition agreement of the federal government. With regards to Namibia, the coalition agreement reaffirms that, and I quote, "Reconciliation with Namibia remains for us a crucial task arising from our historical and moral responsibility. The reconciliation agreement with Namibia can mark the beginning of a shared process of reckoning with the past." End of quote. We hope that together with the Namibian government and the affected communities, we will soon be able to finalize the reconciliation agreement. But as my dear colleague, Excellency Mikondro Kapanda-Girnus, can also describe, the discussions around this agreement are not always easy and they are ongoing. We recognize that colonial experiences are very different in the various societies. There is no one fits all approach. Therefore, Germany pursues an individual approach depending on the country context and giving the countries on the territories of former German colonies the appropriate space and time. We deliberately do not want to act in a neocolonial manner, in the sense of first you colonized us, now you decolonize us. It is not on us to decide about the pace or the manners to coming to terms with the colonial past. In order to overcome such colonial continuities, we employ a partnership-based approach, which means that we actively involved affected societies as well as diasporas, academia, and state partners through dialogue. To this end, we regularly hold close discussion with state actors and civil society. The fact that Germany is facing up to its historical responsibility and recognizing the injustices committed is also demonstrated by the reconciliation negotiations with Namibia that began in 2015. And this includes the recognition of the genocide against the Herero and Nama people, which Foreign Minister Maas pronounced in 2021. The naming and recognition of colonial injustice was also a central concern of President Steinmeier during his visit to Tanzania, which was former German East Africa, at the beginning of November last year. This was the first time that a German head of state had asked for forgiveness for the acts of violence committed under German colonial rule in former East Africa. On 24th and 25th February of this year, Federal President Steinmeier attended the state funeral for late Namibian President Dr. Hage Geingob, and on this occasion he also clearly mentioned the genocide committed against the Nama and Herero and underscored that from his view it was high time to tender an apology. And I quote, "Reconciliation is not about closing the past, it is about taking responsibility for our past, and it is a commitment to a better future together. I hope," still quote, "I will be able to return to this country, Namibia, very soon and under different circumstances because I'm convinced that it is high time to tender an apology to the Namibian people." He also underscored the commitment of the German government to successfully conclude the negotiations on a joint declaration, and we are encouraged by the fact that the new Namibian president, Dr. Nangolo Mumba, has asked the new Namibian foreign minister to conclude these negotiations. So let me briefly touch on another aspect of our foreign policy that shows more specifically how Germany addresses its colonial past: the issue of collections from colonial contexts, the question of how to deal with and return cultural objects or human remains brought to Germany from former colonies. Our national return policy is laid out in the so-called framework principles for dealing with items from colonial context, which was published 5 years ago in 2019. They form the basis for the return of cultural artifacts, but also for the repatriation of human remains. One main principle is that transparency and research are prerequisites for returns. The majority of institutions in Germany that hold cultural artifacts and human remains from colonial context are meanwhile actively working to clarify the provenance of these collections. We want to know whom the objects originally belonged to and how they came to Germany. The museums are conducting this research with the involvement of the countries and societies of origin. Give you an example, the return of the so-called Benin bronzes to Nigeria 2022 was only possible because the return process was preceded by several years of cooperation at museum level between the Benin Dialogue Group and with the involvement of the Royal House of Benin. Several requests for restitutions from countries of origin have been received, are being examined, and will be discussed at government level and with the communities of origin on the basis of this so-called, or mentioned, framework principles. Similar steps have been taken regarding human remains. A recent survey on human remains in German museums and university collections concluded that roughly half of all human remains in German collections cannot be attributed to a country of origin, not even to a region. It is clear that great efforts still need to be made to record, inventory, and identify human remains. So the work is ongoing. To us, it is particularly important to support the descendants of the victims of violence committed by German colonial troops in identifying the human remains of their ancestors. We hope that further advancement will be made soon in this regard, so that it becomes clear what we are doing to addressing this part of our colonial past. The federal government is, as outlined before, still at the beginning. More academic research into our colonial past is needed. For this, the Federal Foreign Office is funding a research scholarship program, which is called German Colonial Rule Scholarship Program for Cooperative Research. It expands our research partnerships and brings in a critical reappraisal of the German colonial past. Young doctoral candidates from Burundi, Cameroon, Namibia, Rwanda, Tanzania, and the Philippines conduct research on the role of the Federal Foreign Office and other German authorities during the German colonial period. In addition, the German Foreign Office has initiated an edition on the Federal Foreign Office and the colonies' history, memory, heritage, where independent international experts analyze the role of the Federal Foreign Office. The first publication is planned 2024. This is what I wanted to tell you what we are doing. So we are at the beginning. I very much are sure that much more will come, and my experience also in countries where I served, which were not colonial territories from Germany, is that looking together to our past, for instance in Baghdad, on things which are not particularly colonial, but perhaps a little bit on the train, the Baghdad ban is really central always to the job of an ambassador of my generation and definitely also of the next generations. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. From the German to the Namibian perspective. Dr. Mekonjo Kapandagirnus, thank you very much for being here with us. Dr. Mekonjo Kapandagirnus is Namibia's ambassador to the Benelux and also the European Union. And she has practical expertise in the fields of international law, politics, and economic diplomacy. And prior to her diplomatic assignment and work for the Namibian government, Dr. Kapandagirnus pursued an academic career and taught also public international law and human rights at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and the School of Oriental and African Studies, both University of London College, from 2005 until 2006. Dr. Kapandagirnus is also a member of the Subcommittee of Legal Affairs, which supports the Technical Committee of the Namibian Government's Cabinet Political Committee on Genocide and Reparations. So lots of committees. Doctor, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. I have to correct you. I am no longer an active member of the subcommittee, which I regret very much because I think I would have been able to say, perhaps more about the topic today in terms of the work of that particular, committee. But thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I also want to pay tribute to you, Ambassador Cyril, my dear colleague. I'm very, very happy to be here. I do apologize for my late arrival. I think I have missed many interesting presentations and statements. I caught a little bit of the presentation from Dr. Wang, and I must say this is a topic that I would like to hear more about. It's clear that this is a global conversation with many very different country contexts, and I certainly have a lot to learn. I really thought long and hard about what I would speak about and what I would say to you today. Unlike the eminent speakers who have preceded me, I am not a historian. or a scholar. I am not a researcher, and I'm not a museum professional. Indeed, I'm not a specialist or expert in the topic of today's symposium. Instead, I am Namibian, I'm a diplomat, and I'm a frequent visitor of museums, particularly in this country, I must say. So those are my qualifications, if you will, and they do inform the comments and the observations that I will make today. And let me explain what I mean by that. So firstly, as a Namibian, I am deeply aware of colonial history and the legacies of colonialism. Namibia was profoundly impacted by the colonial experience, and as was, I think, talked about by many speakers before me, during Germany's colonial rule in Namibia, German colonial troops wiped out an estimated 80% of all of the Ovaherero and 50% of the Nama people, seizing huge areas of land in the process in what was really a systematic transfer of wealth that has led to enduring social and economic inequalities. It was the first genocide of the 20th century, and the damage to the livelihood and the identity of these communities has been passed down through generations. There's generational trauma, and this continues to be felt today. General Lothar von Trotha, he was mentioned earlier, the supreme commander of the German colonial troops, the man who issued the infamous Vernichtungsbefehl, or the extermination order, was chosen from a short list of candidates by Kaiser Wilhelm II himself. Secondly, about my second role, I am a diplomat, so I represent a country where questions around colonialism and with all of its past and present implications and consequences are at the heart of our foreign policy and diplomacy. We continue to engage in bilateral negotiations with the German government, as was mentioned by my colleague, about the colonial past and the genocide committed by the Schutztruppe. The repatriation of human remains and cultural heritage objects is an important element of those talks, and we also hope that the talks will be concluded very soon. The manner in which colonialism has become more visible in the domestic discourses of several countries and also the cultural, political, and diplomatic relations between countries is significant, and I will return to this point later. Finally, as a frequent, enthusiastic, but also critical visitor of museums, I am interested in questions such as what or who are museums for? What purpose do they serve? How are they implicated in the reproduction of power dynamics and social hierarchies, today and also in the past? And can they effectively address our colonial heritage and promote healing, reconciliation, mutual understanding, respect, accountability, and justice? I will return to those questions also later. So as I mentioned, issues around colonial history and its legacies have become very, very important in our national politics and also in our international relations, in Namibia's international relations. And this is not unique to our country. And also, issues around restitution or the restitution of items obtained during colonial conquest and occupation is not new. In fact, you can see restitution petitions and claims and arguments in relation to colonial pasts and colonial artifacts in particular that go back a very long time, all the way to the 18th century. But I would argue that these petitions and these claims enjoy more visibility today. Public awareness has increased, and the discussion has moved beyond the academia, and it has penetrated political and social circles, the media and popular culture. We have a spirited global conversation which has really reached new levels. And I'm sure this is an example that has been mentioned before. The report from 2021 that Bénédicte Savoy, a French art historian, and the Senegalese academic and writer Felwine Sarr published. I think the report was from, I think, 2018, but the two of them were included onto Time magazine's prestigious list of the 100 most influential people in 2021. And this was the result of work that they did that was commissioned by President Macron, and the report that they published is called The Restitution of African Cultural Heritage. And the report really generated a lot of momentum that spilled over into many other European countries, and undoubtedly this was also fueled by the activities of social movements that were demanding racial justice and decolonization. I think a good example of such movement is the Black Lives Matter movement, which has campaigned on a number of important issues in domains such as history, culture, and the arts. So I think after a long history of deflection, of obstruction and disavowal, we seem to be experiencing a cultural shift in favor of repatriation. More and more museums are recognizing the desire for the repatriation of colonial-era cultural artifacts, and they are willing to return them. And in recent years, I think it's clear that we have seen examples of many European countries returning colonial artifacts, and it has become more commonplace to see global headlines describing the ceremonial return of said cultural artifacts. Some countries have developed policy and legal frameworks around art repatriations. Germany is a good example of that. But even the European Parliament has dealt with this topic, and you can have a look at specific parliamentary committees talking about the need to develop European guidelines and encouraging EU member states to initiate processes of restitution. So Namibia has participated in a number of projects and initiatives involving the repatriation and the restitutions of artifacts with countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Finland, and South Africa. We have Namibian institutions such as the National Museum of Namibia, which operates under the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture. We have the University of Namibia and the Museums Association of Namibia, and all of them work together collaboratively in order to pursue a common goal, which is to identify, repatriate, and then engage in restitution of Namibian heritage located beyond the borders of our country, particularly in Germany and German-speaking countries. So I would like to use the Namibian experience, talk about the Namibian experience, and also use my own analysis of the global conversation around colonial art and artifacts to make a number of observations in relation to the topic of this symposium. The first observation that I would like to make is that colonial art and colonial art repatriations have political and diplomatic implications. What do I mean by that? I think it's very clear that debates around art repatriations can strain diplomatic relations between countries, particularly when requests for restitutions are either ignored, when they are denied, or acceded to with certain conditions. And we have seen this not only with repatriations or repatriation claims between countries of the global north and south, but also between European countries, for example, between the UK and Greece in relation to the Parthenon marbles, which is a very well-known case. It has attracted a lot of media attention. So on the one hand, you can have tension if this process is not managed well. At the same time, however, successful repatriation negotiations can enhance diplomatic relations between countries. If they are done correctly, they can promote transnational collaboration and support processes of dialogue and reconciliation. And this collaboration can take place at the level of governments, but it can also involve knowledge institutions, cultural institutions, and other stakeholders. And I think that in a world of increasing polarization, of division and inequality, where populism and xenophobia are resurging, art repatriations can play an important and positive role in building partnerships, trust, mutual respect, and understanding in a very important area of international cooperation, namely culture. And I think going forward, it will be important for countries to put in place legal and diplomatic frameworks, both at national but also at multilateral levels that enable successful repatriations. I think we need robust domestic and international regimes that can provide normative and legal templates for contemporary colonial era restitution cases. And I think this is also where diplomats like myself can play an important role, maybe a new role, a role that we're not maybe familiar with, and that requires that we increase our knowledge and our understanding of this topic, because only if we do that can we be effective facilitators, mediators, and negotiators who can competently support the work of experts, practitioners, such as historians, heritage scholars, and museum managers. And as a Namibian diplomat, I certainly see colonial art repatriations as part of a broader struggle of or by African countries to secure equality and fairness on the global stage, this time in the cultural sphere. My second point is that museums which hold colonial art and colonial artifacts have an opportunity, but in my mind also a very clear responsibility to work towards redress and restitutions. Colonial collections represent and embody the history, the heritage, and the culture of previously colonized peoples. And they were frequently acquired in context or in the context of colonial expansion, conquest, and occupation, which in turn were accompanied by violence, both epistemic and physical. And you have commentators who highlight that museums which hold colonial era cultural heritage are essentially public archives of the system of appropriation, alienation, and, in the case of Namibia, genocide that underpinned the colonial system. And furthermore, it can be argued that the continued presence of this heritage in European museums, particularly in the face of repatriation requests, that the presence of these items is really denying previously colonized people of their cultural and artistic heritage. So when you have collections that are steeped in such a history of colonization, I think museums should embrace the opportunity to become agents and sites for the redress and repair of injustices, both historical and continuing. And they can do this in different ways. They can curate exhibitions which really lay bare colonial genealogies, and they can invite visitors to their museums to reflect on how colonialism has shaped their collections and also the world at large. They can, of course, return colonial era artifacts, very much important. They can engage in cross-institutional collaborations. They can establish cooperation with communities and stakeholders in the source countries of colonial collections. They can develop new learning resources, and they can engage in interdisciplinary dialogue with artists, with diplomats, with legal scholars, scientists, and activists. So the possibilities are endless, but I do believe that actions of redress and repair should be guided by certain principles and values. And this brings me to my third point. So if colonialism was a process of erasure, of subjugation and dispossession and the denial of equality, then any corrective efforts by museums and others to promote redress should be animated by inclusivity, mutual respect, genuine collaboration, and partnerships. And in this context, I want to quote the director of the Museums Association of Namibia, because she advocates for, and I quote, collaborative frameworks that prioritize meaningful engagement with Namibian stakeholders and foster co-creation processes that honor and integrate diverse voices and knowledge systems. So it's really important that when historians, when scholars, when museum professionals from different countries collaborate in relation to colonial artifacts, that they do so on the basis of equal and reciprocal terms of engagement, so that you don't have the reproduction of the old sort of asymmetric power relations that we know and that characterize the colonial enterprise. As a final point, I want to say a few words about the complexity of reintegrating previously appropriated colonial artifacts in their source countries and communities. Because the reality is that the return journey of these objects and artifacts can be challenging, and the work certainly does not end with the transfer from one museum to another. And this is because, firstly, such artifacts were not taken from museums. They were taken, for example, from local villages where they had a very specific ritual function. So the argument can be made that they should be returned to those communities. Secondly, the removal of cultural artifacts from their source communities can cause generations of memory loss and knowledge asymmetries that are very difficult to address. And this can be compounded by the